What did that one teacher do to you that you'll never forget? Senior year, I was placed in a freshman typing class. Everyone else was chatty and goofed off, but I wanted to learn to type, so I really put in a lot of effort. I only had 2 classes in the morning, and the rest of the day I was a waitress, as I was pretty much on my own in my senior year. Then I got called into the work on the day of our class final, so I went to work and I missed the final. When I showed up to class the next day, I apologized to the teacher for missing the final. Then he asks me, "Do you want to know the grade you got?" And I replied yes. And then he told me, "I gave you an A, because if you had been here, that's what you would have gotten." And I never forgot that. Thank you, Mr. Wyatt. Story number 2. At my high school, we had an annual week-long science trip, fully paid for by fundraising. Only 4 people were selected to go each year. My sophomore year, I was chosen. I knew there was no way I was going to be allowed to go. I had never been out of the state, never been on a single vacation, never been on a plane, and never been away from home for more than 24 hours. My parents were incredibly conservative and said immediately no. I had a science teacher who just didn't accept the no. Instead of just giving up and selecting someone else, he called and tried to convince my parents. When that didn't work, he came to my house and had dinner with my family to convince my dad that I would be an asset and he would be doing me a disservice by not letting me go. He sat and ate my mom's terrible cooking and spoke to my parents for over 2 hours until he got a "we'll think about it." Then he just kept following up. I had never had someone in my corner like that before, who was willing to go to bat for me like that. He wore them down, and it was the best week of my teenage life. I'd never seen the ocean. 20 years later, and I can still recall every detail of that trip. It was a major pivot point for me. Story number 3. Oh boy. Grade 3, I said, "Aw, crap," when I got tagged out. Rounding second during a game of soccer baseball, Canadian term for kickball, and a little girl covering the base screamed, "Teacher, OP said the C word." So I got put on detention and yelled at for the rest of the day until I finally snapped on my teacher at the end of the day and said, "Listen, teacher, I don't get it at all. All I said was, 'aw, crap,' when she caught the ball, and I didn't even know that that was a swear word." The teacher replied, "Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said the other C word." And I said, "What is the other C word?" And she tells me, "Ask your mother." At the end of the day, I got into the van and told my mom what happened. She broke out laughing her ass off and explained to me when I asked that the word the teacher thought I had said was idiot. So I went to school the next day and told all of my friends, "Hey guys, guess what word I just learned?" Story number 4. Told me I was smart and could succeed. I had spent the past couple of years at a private school trying so hard to prove myself. Despite doing well academically, I did not fit their cookie-cutter mold. So I was looked down on by other students in administration. When I told the guidance counselor that I wanted to be pre-med and go to med school after college, she pretty much told me to lower my expectations because I wouldn't succeed. At the end of my college math class my senior year of high school, I ended up in my professor's office to look at what I had missed on my final. He told me that I had done well and that I could get my PhD in math if I wanted. That was not what I wanted to do, but when I told him I wanted to be pre-med, he looked at me and said, "You're going to do well in that. I know you will succeed." 6 years later, and I'm halfway through my second year of medical school, and his words still ring in my mind. Okay, so as somebody who at least tries to be positive in day-to-day life, I would like to point out that OP was motivated by just 2 positive sentences said to them. OP is halfway through their second year of medical school because of 2 positive sentences. Sometimes it doesn't take a lot to lift someone up. That's all I'm trying to say. I love complimenting people. It's so easy and it's fun, and they go, "Ha, thank you." Anyway, next story. Story number 5. Not me, my brother. He had one of those haircuts that was popular in the mid-90s where you have long fringe, maybe 5-inch hair, but was skinhead for the rest. He was a skateboarder. Anyway, the woodshop teacher decided that the haircut was a health and safety hazard and swiftly cut his hair in front of the whole class, meanwhile berating him, being like, "Kids today, etc., etc." My brother was 12 and came home from school crying. My father was less than pleased and apparently went up to school and made a right kerfuffle, as he should, and my mother was very embarrassed by it all. I'll never forget it. Story number 6. I've always loved learning and loved going to school. I was a good kid and never really got into trouble. One year, my parents got called in for a parent-teacher conference. One by one, each of my teachers told my parents that I acted out during class, was a distraction, etc. This came as a surprise to my parents as I had never gotten in trouble and my grades were always good. Finally, the conversation got to my history teacher and my science teacher. They were speechless. My history teacher told my parents that he wished he had a classroom full of students with a passion for learning like me, and that if other teachers put in as much effort into teaching as I did into learning, then there would not be an issue. My science teacher agreed and apologized for wasting my parents' time. The rest of the school year was interesting. I could tell there was tension between certain groups of my teachers. My history teacher would later become the principal of that school, and I could not think of anyone more deserving of that role. Story number 7. Freshman English teacher in college. He had a last name with 2 capital letters in it, so something like McConnor. On the top of one of my first papers, I wrote McConnor, and he told me that I spelled his name incorrectly. Now, obviously, this confused me because the spelling was indeed correct, and it took a few minutes of back and forth confusion before he told me what I did wrong. Like a typical 18-year-old kid, I kind of just shrugged it off, and I was like, who the F cares? And his response was essentially, if you don't care enough about your writing to get it correct, why the hell should somebody else care enough to read it? The response hit pretty close to home. Not initially, of course, because I was an 18-year-old craphead, but now 15 years later, I still think about it from time to time, and it does force me to put more effort into many of the things that I do. Story number 8. When I was in 5th grade in 1975, my parents were divorcing, and I was living with my abusive father. If I didn't get a B+ or better on my report card, I got the belt. Not a little, mind you, a full-on beatdown, and probably denial of meals for a while. The 70s with an abusive parent were a very different time. My father had quite a reputation in the small Pennsylvania town that I lived in, McKean, PA, and he was known as an incredibly strict person, and our neighbors all hated him. But this was a different time, and that sort of behavior was just ignored in public. My 5th grade math teacher, Mr. Cunningham, scared me. He looked a bit like my father, and didn't suffer any nonsense in his classroom at all. I struggled with mathematics, and it just didn't make sense to me. We got our first report card in 5th grade, and these were the days where you could carry a card with you for the day, and the teacher would write your grade on the report card. You would then have to take it home and have to have a parent sign it to acknowledge that they had seen your grades. So far through the day, the grades were good. A's, mostly an A-, but all good. Math was my last class of the day before I had to catch the bus. When my report card came back to me, I froze in terror. I recall this moment like a photograph. The grade was a D, written in pen right there on the report card. I knew what was coming. The blood drained out of my face. Mr. Cunningham dismissed the class, and I was frozen in my desk, scared of what he would do, and even more scared of what my father would do. All the other kids had left the classroom, and my world around me was gone. Just me, my books, and the D staring at me, telling me that my 10-year-old self was going to suffer badly. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder, and I shook and I started crying. Mr. Cunningham looked at me. He took my report card out of my hand and walked up to his desk. He called me up there. I was still terrified, probably shaking, definitely trying to hide my crying and failing. He got out a black pen and changed the D into a B+. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me. He knew. He could see the signs, and he knew how terrified I was and why. I had no idea an adult could be so compassionate, and had no idea it was even possible to change something like that. He handed my report card back to me and said 2 words that have stayed with me to this day. He said, "Earn this." He put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, "I know, it's not fair, and I'm sorry. You're a smart kid, and you can get this. Just ask for my help." My teacher knew. It was a simple act of kindness, and it stuck with me to this day. The math grade didn't matter. I'm successful enough in my 50s to not have that come up on my permanent record, but the permanent change of my impression of Mr. Cunningham is still very much with me. If you have power over other people, you have to wield that power with compassion. You have to tailor that power to meet the needs of the individual. That is the lesson I learned that day from Mr. Cunningham. The next terms, I got a B+ or better. I assume it's because I worked really hard, and Mr. Cunningham helped me out at lunch. Or he was kind because he knew. Thank you, Mr. Cunningham. This was 45 years ago, and I still remember you. Story number 9. 2nd grade. Mrs. Smith, real name, but it's too generic to matter. 2 boys were arguing with each other over which one had the bigger chicken. Again, 2nd grade. This wasn't sexual or tied to masculinity. This was just 2 kids making a competition out of anything and everything they could. They were discussing this louder than I think they realized, so Mrs. Smith headed towards them with her famous ruler. This was nearly 30 years ago, and in an inner-city public school, she absolutely hit kids with that ruler, and we absolutely deserved it. And while the rest of the class thought they knew what was coming, we were wrong. She slammed the ruler on one of the boys' desks and yelled out, "Until you've got it tucked into your sock, I don't want to hear another word about it." And not only were we all stunned that they didn't get a whack from a ruler, but the mental image of a chicken long enough to tuck into a sock. Again, 2nd grade, no sexuality innuendo existed for us, and we were hysterical. Pretty soon, the whole class was laughing at the 2 boys who instantly become embarrassed. I'd say they blushed, but again, inner city school, and they got lots of new sock-related nicknames from then on. That has always stuck out in my memory as just a funny moment. Story number 10. She outed me for pretending to not speak English to my mom. I am Mexican American, but I'm one of those lame border crossed me ones who really are American natives, if we're being honest. At any rate, I ignored my kindergarten teacher so much that she assumed I didn't speak English. I'd skipped state testing because I had been to 6 to 7 elementary schools as my mom was skipping out on rent. Middle of first grade, a random teacher realizes I'm reading library books brought from home in the back and not doing work, which is not common in a special ed classroom. She called my mom and teacher to a meeting, had me tested as gifted, told my mom that I was pretending to not understand my teachers, and told us that in second grade I was going to be in her room. I was in trouble for the first and last time in school. Looking back, this is such an impactful memory. She was the only teacher who cared about me at all. When they opened my backpack at the meeting, I had it packed with random books. I had encyclopedias from my grandparents' house, stuff from 3 school libraries, magazines. Mrs. Judah changed my effing life because she cared enough to ask the librarian what language I spoke to help me pick more age-appropriate books. I was reading a high school level novel because the school had just been converted from K through 12. It turns out high school books were appropriate for me. Not age-appropriate, but reading level. I love her and will never forget the stash of books she kept for me when they converted the library for K through 5. Story number 11. It was flu season in 8th grade. My first year back to public school since 1st grade. I was in English class and a bunch of kids had already gone home with sore throats or coughs, so it wasn't uncommon for someone to ask to go to the nurse. I had a sore throat, but I was also having a panic attack. I don't think there was any particular reason, maybe we had a test coming up or something, but I was not very good at the moment. I asked to go to the nurse for my sore throat, and my teacher said yes, so I did. Once I got there, I told the nurse about everything. She didn't quite know what to do about my panic attack, but she took my temperature and everything and said it didn't look like the flu, but I could call my mom to see if she would pick me up anyways. I said I would like that, and I did so. She was on her way, so I went back to get my things and inform my teacher. I met him halfway to the classroom in the hallway and told him I was going home, but that it was because I was having a panic attack and not because of my sore throat. He stopped walking and looked at me for a second, holding both of his hands out to me. I hesitated before putting my hands in his, and he prayed for me right there in the hallway. He talked to me for a second and said that I could beat this and that he had panic attacks too sometimes. Leaving him in middle school when I graduated to 9th grade was one of the hardest things I'd had to do. To this day, that talk helped me more than anything my therapists have ever said. Story number 12. My sophomore English teacher was infamous for being a difficult but good teacher, and all of his classes were notoriously hard to pass. Despite doing the reading and homework assignments, he graded essays and such extremely harshly. But despite all of this, I felt I learned the most about how to write effectively from his class. He was also generally hilarious and had great stories from being a taxi driver in New York City. His witticisms were so popular we started writing them all down and putting them up on a website for everyone in the school to enjoy. However, I will never forget the time he gave us an oral pop quiz on Catcher in the Rye. You see, he had a class that was in a period before lunch and then our class, which was a period after lunch. Of course, having friends in his class before lunch, we oftentimes would share the questions on the quizzes and tests so we would be better prepared. Well, he must have been onto us scoring too highly in recent weeks, so he threw us all a curveball, as the final question of his pop quiz was, "What am I thinking right now?" Well, the answer was, "You will all now receive a failing grade on this quiz." Ended up with a D+ in that class and had to retake it again in summer school, but I still think it was one of the best classes I took in high school. Story number 13. I was more depressed than I had ever been, 14 years old and hating myself more every day. We were in Mr. V's English class doing an analysis of Shakespeare sonnets. He gave us 5 minutes to read and write notes and then called on students to talk. I was really embarrassed that I wouldn't get the right answer, so I didn't raise my hand. Of course, he called on me in this honors class thinking I wasn't good enough, couldn't muster a word. I looked at my paper blankly as if it was empty. I've never felt that intense anxiety in a class before, but I lost all ability to speak. He chastised me and said, "Did you even do it?" And I replied yes. And then he said, "So read it." And he let the agonizing silence go on for over a minute before yelling at me to focus and then moving on. His best friend at the school was Mr. D, my English teacher the following year. I was told by my all-time favorite teacher that the two men talked about me in the staff room and she overheard it. I had just gotten over mono and was out for 2 weeks. He gave me approval to turn in an essay a few days late since I didn't have adequate time to work on it. When I came to class, I did not turn the paper in on Tuesday, but Wednesday. When I went after school to drop it off, he stared daggers at me. "Why is this late? You really want a letter grade off?" Me, shocked, I'm like, "I just had mono. You told me my first day back I could have an extra day to finish it." Then he says, "Are you sure? Because I would never say that." I reply with, yeah, I'm positive. And then he rolls his eyes, grabs the paper, and told me this is unacceptable. I loved middle-aged men who pick on teen girls who hate themselves. So I have an anonymous source regarding this story that I cannot expose or elaborate on in any way whatsoever, but my source tells me that Mr. V and Mr. D are big, bald, quote, meanie bobinis. My source then goes on to claim that both gentlemen reek of onions, their cars desperately need an oil change, and their wives have left them both. They are now heterosexual lovers, and the only thing that unites them together is making fun of and tormenting a teenage high school student. Ugh, next story. Story number 14. There are two of them. I struggled really badly during high school. I was going through the worst of my depression and undiagnosed PTSD from child abuse. I was making plans for self-unaliving and had practice runs with drowning myself in the bath. My mother was in denial about my abuse because she felt guilt about trusting my abusers who offered her financial and childcare help and took complete advantage to abuse me. My attendance at school dropped rapidly. During one of the days I managed to show up to class, I had one of the worst experiences in my teenage life. My algebra class had two teachers. One of them was taking attendance, and he was surprised I was in my seat. He said, "Oh, OP, you're here." Then the other teacher, he scoffed and said, "Yeah, OP is here, but too bad it's raining outside." And it just made me feel so horrible about myself. I stopped showing up for classes for the next month. The second teacher was my 10th grade English teacher. I effing love him because he saved my life. He noticed I was struggling, and he noticed that I was getting worse. So he took me under his wing. He listened to my story. He never judged me. He let me sit in his office during my lunch breaks or when I was feeling really bad halfway through the days that I did show up. Before spring break, he stopped me from leaving right away during one of the days I showed up and handed me two books, 1984 and Animal Farm. He said to me, "I remember how you loved Fahrenheit 451 so much that you read through it in one day and came in the next day very excited about the book and wanting to talk about it. These two have a similar theme to that book. I'll lend it to you for spring break. Let me know what you think. This isn't homework. I just want you to enjoy reading the books." Honestly, that moment is very precious to me. He was essentially the first person ever to have paid attention to me enough to remember what I did months prior. Not even my mother, too wrapped up in her guilt, remembered what I did the day before. When I finally graduated, I asked if he would sign my yearbook. He went above and beyond by writing me an entire letter in cursive on the back page and book cover of my book. It was such an encouraging letter that I'm still reading it when I struggle, and I'm now 25 years old. Story number 15. Back in high school, I had a gym teacher that loved to make bets with students, and she always honored the bets that she lost. Well, once a week we would run the pacer test, but the day before we had a free choice day where you got 5 options to pick from activities. It's about 3 weeks into the year and I choose basketball. Eventually, I make the bet with her that if I hit a half-court shot, I wouldn't have to run the pacer test for the rest of the year. But if I miss, I had to get 85 every time we ran the pacer test. She agrees, and I pull it from half court and drain it. She turns to me and goes, "Well, F me, this is going to be a tough one to work out with the other teachers." And the period ended. I was pretty well known to try hard in gym class, so apparently the other teachers didn't mind not bringing it up anywhere as long as it didn't become an issue further along the line. And for the rest of the school year, I didn't have to run the pacer test. Best teacher ever. Bonus story. The teacher used to have rafter races in the weight room at the high school. Basically, we'd get a pair of kids to hop up and dangle from the rafters of the weight room, about 10 feet off the ground, so not a high height to fall from, and you'd have to shimmy across the rafters while you dangle from them. She would get the whole class involved, having us pick up half of the weight room where one half bets on kid A and the other bets on kid B, with push-up punishments, where if you bet on the wrong kid, then you'd have to do a bunch of push-ups. That teacher was pretty dope. Enjoyed her class thoroughly. Story number 16. He was an effing a-hole to me. At the beginning of his 11th grade English class, he asked anyone who disliked math to raise their hands, and after, suggested that those people should take their lesser English requirement for bullcrap reasons I can't remember. He was one of those teachers who acted like they didn't give a crap and would treat you like an adult instead of coddling. He wanted to be an example of the a-holes we would encounter in the real world. I was one of those kids who raised their hand. Needless to say, I hate math, and found out after I had finished high school that I had dyscalculia. Of course, angsty teen me was indignant when he suggested I take the basic course, because English has always been my strongest subject when I cared to put effort in. Then I handed in my first essay and he saw my potential. He became harder, mocking almost, and more critical. I would get just furious and pump out top-notch university-level essays just to be able to tell him to shove it. Within a month, he was giving me extra assignments. My work was read aloud in class as shining examples of flawless work. I still have every one that marked perfect. Nothing felt better than he would hand back our papers, get to me, give me a clap on the shoulder, and a firm nod. That high was better than any drug. He challenged me in a way I hadn't been. He saw past my crap attitude and truancy and honed my inherent talent. I wish I had more teachers who actually saw me as a person with potential. Story number 17, 7th grade science. I had developed a procrastination senioritis habit even in middle school for things that didn't interest me or seemed boring. Usually I'd miss homeworks for history and English and always did math and science, but this time I was just not feeling it, so I didn't do the work over the weekend. The science teacher walks around the class to take a glance at everyone's homework assignments and usually would quiet down and wait for her to make her round. Being the smartass I am, when she got to me and asked me why it was empty, I told her my cerebral cortex is still growing, so I'm learning how to make the best decisions. In an instant reply, she says, "Well, it better grow fast if you want to take honors next semester," in front of the whole class. Everyone looking at me and her. 2 seconds later, everyone is laughing and smiling, without having any words to say. I did all the homeworks for the rest of the class. Sad part is, cerebral cortex isn't even the decision-making part of the brain. That's the frontal lobe. So, the frontal lobe is usually done developing at around the age of 25, and y'all, let me tell you, I swear I heard the ding go off in my brain around that time. It was like the brownies in the oven were done, and I was a full adult. I had done it. Now, if only we got like a trophy or something, I feel like that would have been like way cooler, but that's just me. Anyway, next story. Story number 18. I had just started at a new secondary school. Most of the rest of my class had been together at primary school, so we're all bonded. A place at the school had only become available at the last minute, and the local supplier did not have the full uniform, so I stood out and kept being stopped by staff to explain my clothing. My father had poor health and was disabled, and I felt very much the odd one out on so many counts. One afternoon at registration, I was told to report to the school's office. I was then shown into the head's office, and by then I was in tears. An increasingly common event, and the head took charge and I was put into a huge armchair in front of an open fire. She then proceeded to explain that she just wanted to know if everybody was making me welcome and how my first week was going. At the same time, she proceeded to serve me tea and cakes. I happily tucked in and poured my heart out about school and home. She gave me a note to show any staff who asked about my uniform, and I spent the whole afternoon there and was released in time for the bus home. She told me to tell anybody who asked that our conversation was private, and I couldn't tell them anything. I even avoided any homework. I walked out feeling that a huge weight was lifted and had a fun evening with my family. I suspect now that there must have been some telephone conversations. All the difficulties I had mentioned just melted away overnight. It was a turning point, and I started to settle, and I have never forgotten it. Story number 19. I was applying to the UK for my university education, and since my high school exam results would only be released after the application date, I had to submit predicted grades. I had been doing well in biology. I maintained my grades in the top 20 in the cohort, and my biology teacher always wrote pretty encouraging remarks on my exam papers, and I had really needed an A predicted grade for the course I was applying to. It was meant to be confidential, but since I was applying to universities elsewhere in the world too, another one of my teachers gave me a copy of my predicted grades, and it turns out that my wonderful biology teacher gave me a B for my predicted grade, and she essentially screwed up my application. Most of the universities rejected me, and one of them actually told me it was a result of my predicted grades. And just as I had expected, when my final results were released months after I received all my rejection letters, I had gotten an A for biology. And it just so happened that she was in charge of my class. And I'll never forget the expression on her face as she handed me my final exam slip. Story number 20. I've told this story before, but here's once more. I was easily the best student in my class in high school, especially when it came to math, physics, chemistry, and the like. I was one of the fortunate ones to whom stuff came very easily to. However, I was pretty shy and didn't really participate in class. I just aced every test. My classmates obviously knew I was great at these subjects, so they'd often come to me for help instead of going to the teacher. Most teachers couldn't really give less of an F, but there was this one idiot. It's been a while, so I can't remember her name, but she taught geometry. She came determined one day to expose me, apparently, and she drew a very convoluted problem on the board and gave us 5 minutes to solve for some angle. It was the kind of problem that would take me 20 minutes at the very least, and that the rest of the class would probably find impossible to get through. Yet, as soon as the 5 minutes were up, she ordered me to get up on the board and solve it for the class. I asked her for a little more time, but she insisted I got up so we could do it together, and I didn't really have a choice, so I stood up, walked towards the board, suffered silently for a few moments trying to think of how to approach the problem until she finally relented and gave me pointers on how to solve it. After I did, under her instructions, she sent me back to my seat and told the class that if they had any questions, they should be coming to her. her. I obviously got super angry and was on the verge of tears for the rest of the class. I got her back later that same month though. She had parked her car in a bit of a hidden space, so I pissed on the door handle, which I guess is even more petty than what she did to me, but ever. Story number 21. It was about 5 weeks until the end of my senior year, arguably one of my worst years of my life. I was dealing with a newly absent father, severe depression, resurfaced wanting to self-unalive thoughts, and awful grades as a product. I wanted to do well in my classes genuinely, but lacked all motivation to get anything more than a passing grade. As a previously gifted child, this newfound academic struggle absolutely demolished my self-confidence and made my depression worse. 5 weeks until graduation, and I had just found out from my guidance counselor, who was easily the least qualified person to be in her position, that I was 1.5 credits behind graduating. I moved 2 times during high school, and although this was my last school before graduation, she neglected to count my credits and put me in a position to accomplish all I needed. She neglected to tell me at all the entire year that I was going to be short, or that dropping out of my advanced classes meant that my schedule needed to adjust to finish credits. A fault that was nowhere near my doing, but was left on my shoulders with no remorse from her. I go to my next class, sobbing, immediately stopped by my teacher, who I will call David. He only let us call him by his first name, and I explained my situation, and he was appalled at the lack of responsibility on my counselor's end, and confided in me that he's had to pick up the pieces after she caused troubles with many other students in the past. He immediately contacted other teachers to work out the homework I could do to finish old credits, and himself gave me a workbook and assignment so that he himself could give me my remaining credit. He opened his classroom to me at lunch so I wouldn't have to work at home, and only asked me to do a few chapters of my choosing and turn in typed up responses. And with that, I had finished my credits with 2 weeks to spare. Although he bent the rules to help me graduate, he did it from the bottom of his heart because he saw that I was truly trying. I was struggling, but I was trying my best, and I really did want to turn in good work. He helped make the worst year of my life so much better by making sure that I graduated and got out of that school, because seeing me get left behind due to an overlooked technicality probably would have crushed his heart. He despised the education system and its rigidness, and his best interest was always with his students and their own well-being. In case you couldn't tell, he was my favorite teacher that I've ever had. So, with OP mentioning their guidance counselor in that story, it reminds me of an experience that I had that's relevant to this video. I had a guidance counselor that, my mom and the school wanted me to go to because I wasn't doing so well in classes. Math was my worst subject. And I don't remember what I went there to do specifically, but essentially, I would be taken out of the class that I was struggling in to go talk to this woman for 30 minutes about I don't even know what anymore. She would just kind of vaguely help me with stuff. It really wasn't helpful. And I told my mom at some point, I was like, hey mom, I'm leaving my struggling class to go talk to this lady who knows the subject half as well. How is this going to help me being less in class? And I remember one time the guidance counselor, I was kind of a quiet kid, so I didn't open up well to her. She made fun of me. She was she started impersonating me and being like, oh, I don't know, I'm quiet, I don't know anything. And I was in middle school, and I was like, this woman should not be employed. I hate her, that stupid Romanian woman. Anyway, next story. Story number 22. We had this one student who would straight up verbally abuse the teacher and call her fat and obese and all kinds of nasty stuff. She was always quiet, but you can tell it hurt her. For whatever reason, she never reported it. This was her first year teaching, apparently, so that might have played a role. She was horribly nervous and quiet. I suspected she was mentally ill in some way, but obviously it's hard to tell. One day, she mentioned her ex-husband, and the student blurted out, "Your husband left you? I'm surprised you ever got married, you fat, ugly female dog." And she just absolutely burst into a hysterical crying fit and ran out of the classroom. It was horrible to watch, genuinely some of the worst crying I've ever seen. She just reached a breaking point. She came back and just shrieked at him, "Get out, get out, get out, get out," and was throwing stuff from her desk at him. Then she physically pushed him against the wall, grabbed him, and threw him to the floor, and he got up and ran out of the classroom. Then she just sort of sobbed in the corner, real broken emotionally kind of sobbing. A bunch of students went to comfort her, and I left the classroom to go smoke pot in the park nearby. Story number 23. She called me stupid and said I would never learn to read, write, or do math above an elementary grader's comprehension. I was in 6th grade and struggling because my parents were working too many jobs and didn't have time to teach me anything at home. She made sure to tell me in private when I stayed in during lunch for extra help. I couldn't do basic multiplication and she didn't want to help. Who cares if I thought 3 times 3 equals 6? She didn't. Well, it didn't matter too much in the end because I taught myself calculus a few years later, and now I'm going to medical school in August. I taught myself to read and write, even though she held me as the exemplar of stupidity in class. You know what every single medical school interviewer has complimented me on? My writing skills and unique word choice. After I left her class, I taught myself everything she wouldn't. On a happier note, in college, I cried when a professor called me brilliant. He's now one of my best friends. Story number 24. Sorry if it's hard to read, I'm on mobile. In 7th grade, we had to do a project in science class where you collected bugs and then made a display of them. I was sitting in the back with two boys, and we kept making jokes and drawing dumb stuff instead of actually doing our projects. At one point, both the boys were actually trying to work, but I kept disturbing them. My teacher walked up to me and said something. Now, even then, I knew that I was in the wrong for being a distraction. However, I was starting to notice that this was a regular problem for me in all my classes. I decided to confide him. I told him that no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't concentrate, that literally nothing was making sense to me, and I was just really struggling to focus on stuff. I said I had this issue in every class. He literally rolled his eyes at me and told me I was making excuses just to show off to the boys back here. Now, I know my 13-year-old brain probably didn't explain myself very well, but I was just very insulted trying to open up to a supposed trusted adult, and then I got accused of something dumb like that. It wasn't until my adulthood I was finally diagnosed with ADHD. Story number 25. Grade 1, our schools are known for a more physical discipline back then. So this effing teacher that I got in grade 1, my first ever experience in school ever, she would tell kids that misbehaved to stand up in front of the class and touch your toes, and she would smack a cricket bat onto your ass. Everyone, including the principal, the other teachers, and even parents knew about her actions. But one day she effed up. She was rushing through the classroom rows for everyone to take a seat with her bat, bopping us along the way on our butts if we were slow. Me being a big boy took a little longer than the others, and she tried to hit my butt as I sat down and turned to reach in my bag and ended up hitting my ribs with the bat, and it left a big visible bruise across the side of my body. Essentially, my mom saw the bruise that night after I bathed. I explained to her what happened, and she came the next day to the school and interrupted the whole class mid-reading, threatening to beat the teacher up with her own bat. The principal had to stop it. I got sent home early, and the teacher never used the bat ever again. She instead switched to a wooden ruler and would smack your palm now. This was like in 2001 in South Africa. Story number 26. I grew up on a farm in a town of like 25,000. That is to say, a town that had begun to outgrow farm, and my teacher knew it. I loved English and tried to always pay attention in class. She was extremely strict with students about being focused and paying attention during class. She also had a little reading book with pillows and blankets and books in the corner of the room. This will come into play later. One day, I was falling asleep during classes. For the life of me, I could not stay awake. This had been going on during other classes of the day. Teachers had slammed books on the floor next to my desk, shamed me in front of the class, etc. Finally, English class comes around and it's the same story. It's been such a day and I'm so tired. One of the other students, knowing how strict our teacher was on people who weren't paying attention, decided to throw me under the bus when we were supposed to be reading and told our teacher I was sleeping. I remember waking up right as they ratted on me. Mrs. Lambert then looked over at me and noticed me trying to wake up and looked back at the other student, the rat, and said, "You've never in a day in your life put in the effort that OP has put in yesterday. OP, why don't you tell the rat what you did yesterday, then go grab yourself a spot in the nook and you can sleep the rest of class." Well, my dad and I had spent the entire night before cutting a cow out of an ice pond that she'd fallen into in the middle of the night while trying to find water. I had probably spent an entire night closer to hypothermia than I had ever hoped to see again in my life, and I'd gotten about 45 minutes of shut-eye before my dad had woken me up to leave for school. I hadn't even told her what happened. She just knew I loved her class and wouldn't blow it off. After a day of being heckled by the rest of the adults in the building, this small act of kindness really blew me away. Story number 27. Grade 11 English class. I'll never forget how effing mortifying this was for me. My teacher was teaching us how to write cliffhangers in stories. Super easy for me because all the shows I watched had cliffhangers, so I knew how to write these type of endings out. Anyways, she told us to use very personal stories, so it's easier for us to write these types of endings, and I decided to choose some personal topics that I was dealing with since grade 11. It was a very, very hard year for me on a personal level. My teacher had said pick 3 stories all the same or different to write 3 types of cliffhangers. So I chose to write about a really bad breakdown I had one night, my eating disorder and the issues I was having with it, and I believe the third was about having depression and anxiety. So I write 3 really killer cliffhangers, and my teacher decides last minute we were going to trade these papers to the person besides us to read and mark. I had no choice but to give that paper to this girl I barely knew who sat beside me and had her read about some stupidly personal topics I had written about. After that, I never got personal with an essay again in her class. My marks were so bad because I couldn't trust her with anything I wrote about because she broke my trust right off the bat with this in-class assignment. I was beyond mortified by it, and it's been 6 to 7 years since this happened, and I'm still mortified by it. I've had a strong dislike for that teacher since. So, to piggyback off of this one, I have another relevant story to share. I'll probably have like 3 school stories that I'll share throughout the course of this video, but to make it quick, when I was in college, I had this English writing class or whatever, and at the start of each class, the professor wanted us to get this notebook and write down one page at the start of each class. So, I used it as a journal, just to write, personal stuff. And she said, at the end of the semester, she'll grade it. And if you don't trust her, you can staple the pages together so that she'll just vaguely see that you filled out the page and then give you the grade. So I interpret that as, oh, she's not going to read it, she's just going to see a full page, continue, give you your grade. So at some point throughout the semester, week 8, 9, 10, or whatever, in the middle of writing personal stuff, on the middle of the page, I just made an offhanded remark and said, is the teacher even going to see this? Thinking to myself, I could just fill this page up with BS if I wanted to and just put blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it's towards the end of the semester, we turn in the notebooks, we get them back like a week or so later, and I'm scrolling through to see what I wrote, and the teacher writes one sentence in my whole thing. She circles is the teacher even going to see this thing that I wrote? And she just said, yes, I do. And I was like, oh my God, she read some of my deepest, darkest personal secrets that I was going through at the time. And I felt so incredibly violated, and I still cringe about it a bit to this day. I can't believe she did that. I hate that lady. Anyway, next story. Story number 28. In year 8, I had a teacher who taught me Spanish and French. I was terrible at both. And because it was the same classroom, we sat in the same seats. So not much changed from Spanish to French. On this one day, I had a test. I knew I would mess it up and wasn't expecting anything from it, so I go in and start the French test. This whole time, I'm lost. I had no idea what to do. I could see that even the people who were better at Spanish than French were writing tons, and I hadn't written a word. So with 2 minutes left, I make a final attempt to write something, literally anything. So I wrote "bonjour," the only French word, and I spelt it wrong. And the teacher then tells us to hand in the sheets, and as I stand up, I look around to realize that the reason why the Spanish speakers did well was because it was a Spanish test, and the only word I had written in a Spanish test was hello in French incorrectly. With nothing but disappointment, I walk to the teacher and hand in the sheet. As I do look at her with honest and shame, I say to her, I really tried, miss. I really did. And then I left. The next week we return and we are getting our results and congratulation cards to those who deserve them. She goes through the people that were expecting to do well because they literally spoke the language, and then she reads the last card and says, this card goes to the person that always tries his best no matter what. She then proceeded to walk to my desk and hand me the card. The card wrote, at least you tried, and I will never forget you, Miss Bernard. Story number 29. I was in 5th grade probably, maybe younger, but we had a student teacher named Mrs. Arana, and for some reason we didn't get along. I kept acting out at school, specifically at her. This was odd behavior for me, probably due to my parents divorcing, who knows. I don't know when the switch happened, but I think she just tried to talk to me. Things mended. I was at my best friend's house one Saturday, who was also in my class, and she called their house asking if she knew a good number to reach my family at, and she had something for me. She was from the Bahamas and had gone back to visit family and had brought me back a wooden elephant with Bahamas written on it, since giving elephants is considered good luck. I also remember her saying her father shares the same birthday as mine, and I haven't been able to find out where she is since then. Also, one night when my dad got physically abusive with my sister and I called my mom crying to pick us up. She was out having drinks with my aunt and ran into my 4th grade teacher. I was his favorite student. The 4th grade's teacher's brother was a cop and heard what was going on and offered to call his brother and got really upset. He pulled me aside the following Monday to make sure I was okay. Still one of my favorite teachers. Story number 30. My sister and I were in a communications class our senior year, and the teacher was a real creep. He would look up girls' skirts, make sexual comments, etc. that made all of the girls uncomfortable. It was even taken to the principal, who basically said we were making more out of it than it was. It was to the point that the anxiety and nausea caused by walking into his class was unbearable. Our health sciences teacher found out about this creep and let us skip his class and sit in a room at the back of her class anytime we needed to go, and gave us an excuse, so we didn't get in trouble. We also had a home ec teacher who would not allow him in her classroom because of the things we were told he did. And for the record, none of the female teachers felt comfortable around him. He had a planning period during her class and would try to come in there to eat whatever we were cooking. I am really thankful for those two amazing teachers who kept a terrible situation from being worse. I would also like to give a virtual middle finger to my pervert teacher and the principal who didn't believe us, even though he was my neighbor and knew my family since I was a little kid. Story number 31. I have two stories about the same guy. We can call him Mr. G. He was a no BS, objective, and honest guy. I was a class clown jock in high school, but also quite bright yet lazy. I could put in medium effort and get a B quite happily. Mr. G knew this and would squeeze every bit out of me to be better by challenging me, finding things that interested me. My academic laziness also drove another teacher crazy since I could easily get an A in her class with minimal effort, and she would, in her own way, try to do the same as Mr. G, but it bordered on bullying. This was Miss C. He stood by my side when I reported Miss C, and he corroborated my claims. I asked him why he did it for me, and he said he didn't, he just hates bullies, according to him. Another time, he caught me cheating when I wrote down the definitions of words inside the label of a water bottle. I had a huge football game that night and also could have been expelled. But he just kept me after class, made me take another test with the same batch of words, and I scored a high 90. He told me I was an idiot, and that what I did was called studying. Learn how to do it. He didn't report me, but he gave me a stern warning, and I never effed off in his class ever again, and always gave people a second chance. Story number 32. I love to tell the story on Reddit of that one teacher, 5th grade, who chastised me for extracurricular reading in class. But instead, I'll talk about my amazing high school AP history teacher, Mrs. H. One day, junior year, I was absent, and Mrs. H took the opportunity to ask my close friends if I was okay. Mrs. H worked lunchroom duty, and I never came to the cafeteria for lunch and weighed 98 pounds soaking wet. She was worried I had an eating disorder. I didn't, but she was legitimately concerned, and my friends urged me to talk to her and clear the air. I waited after class the next day, thanked her for her concern, and let her know I was heating up cups of ramen in the chemistry lab at lunchtime. Her concern did inspire me to put on a few more pounds, and I made an effort to eat in the cafeteria. Another cool thing about Mrs. H was that I had some bizarre conspiracy theory-themed political ideas that my young, naive brain had picked up from my dad. She always spoke the truth and challenged me without ever making me feel foolish or stupid. She also let me become an unnecessary teacher's aide senior year so I could drop a class that was bombing my GPA. She also paid me one of the nicest compliments I ever received when she was the first to notice I'd hit a growth spurt and gotten taller, and my shoulders had gotten broader. Anyways, Mrs. H, you were and are a great person and a great teacher. Edit. Another thing, she and another teacher came to see me and some fellow students in a play at a local theater and offered extra credit to any other students who came to see it. Story number 33. I was made fun of a lot in high school. I was fat and I have autism, so easy for teenagers to ridicule. My senior year, my math class was 95% football players, the group that made fun of me the most. The other 4% were myself, some other people, and one person for my friend group. So anyone who went to Catholic school knows the seating chart drill. You get changed around every quarter. First quarter was fine. Second quarter came around and I was in the center of a circle of football players. Not only was it hard for me emotionally because I could hear them talking about me, but it was hard to focus because they talked the entire class period. This was my third go around in this class. Okay, it was slightly different, but I felt like I learned mostly the same info between Algebra 1, 2, and 3. And as much as I like math, I also struggled. So after about a week of bad classes because I couldn't hear my teacher or focus on the work or get out of my own head over analyzing the insults I heard from my classmates, I worked up the courage to ask my teacher if I could move. The kicker, the only extra desk in the room was right next to my friend. My teacher had obviously seen my struggling because he agreed, but he gave me the condition that if being near my friend became an issue, that he had the right to put me back. Obviously, he's the teacher, duh, but it did kind of make me feel like an equal partner. So I switched seats and I stuck to our agreement. Friend and I would obviously chat before class and during lunch. Our lunch was in the middle of this class, but as soon as the bell rang, we would both shut up. Now, as I only had the bad seat for about a week, my grade hadn't suffered really, but if you looked back at my homework, you can definitely see a difference. I also spent a lot of time in the mornings that week going to my teacher for extra help. As soon as I moved seats, my work improved drastically, and I didn't need to go see my teacher anymore. I was getting an A in math for the first time in high school. I started stopping by the cafeteria in the mornings just to say hi to my teacher. I started to enjoy math class. Clearly, my teacher noticed as well, because third quarter came around and my friend and I are seated next to each other again. We'd kept our end of the bargain, so he extended his. Third quarter, my friend starts getting better grades. Okay, now I'm rubbing off on her. Fourth quarter comes, and again, we're next to each other. I finished that year the same way I started it, with an A in math. It may not seem like much to anyone but me, but that teacher was the first teacher to ever see me and my diagnosis as a person. I'd been diagnosed autistic the year before. I'd been met with many obstacles, and the first being a school system so unwilling to flex their ways to meet the needs of their students. But here I was, with a teacher who never acknowledged my shortcomings, as I saw it then, and he just handled them silently. The fact that he did anything at all for me was astounding to me, but the fact that it became clear he was watching me the entire year and made decisions on what appeared to be best for me that were based on his observations from class, I just had never had a teacher who was so profoundly willing to help me, and he did it all without ever saying a word about it. I still talk about him now, 10 years later, and I read up most of the time. Mr. Marchi, you gave me the confidence to stand up for myself when it came to what needed to be successful in school. You made me see that I'm not stupid. I just need to be shown things differently sometimes. You made me challenge everyone else's notions that I'd never amount to anything, and I did. I blew away everyone by going to college and graduating with honors in less than 4 years. I could have never done any of it if it weren't for you literally just moving my seat in your class. But it has made the absolute biggest difference in my life. You will never understand how grateful I am to you for taking the time to see me as worthy. Story number 34. When I was in the 5th grade, I was constantly picked on by others for being weird. I was a socially anxious kid who liked wearing black, like a goth, and one day I snapped and stood up for myself. My teacher, Mrs. Alilovic, thought I was instigating a fight with the other kids. She pulled me aside at recess and asked me why I was being a bully to the other kids. I was confused at her statement, so I stuttered, trying to correct her, and she looked at me with disdain and said, "Are you on drugs right now? Is that why you can't speak properly?" I was a fairly innocent kid and had no idea what she was talking about, but she kept going as if almost she was mocking me. I heard a giggle from the doorway, and it was a few students trying to listen in. She scolded me for being a rebellious and terrible student, because those kids had heard this teacher accuse me of being on drugs when I was just nervous for being in trouble, and a rumor went around that I was a druggie, and all the other teachers looked down on me. My average grades dropped because the teachers wouldn't take me seriously. Most of the other students didn't talk to me, and my parents just dismissed it and told me it's all because I dressed like a delinquent. If all this hadn't happened, I think I would have grown up a bit more normal. The words Mrs. Alilovic said to me that day effed me up. So yeah, F that teacher. Story number 35. I wouldn't be alive right now if it wasn't for my high school biology teacher. I was literally on the edge about to take my own life. In my freshman year of high school, I had a biology teacher who really loves biology. It's obvious he loved it not because it's his job to teach it. He loved it so much he made it his job to teach it. This guy had a naturally loud, grizzly voice, short-trimmed, weathered facial hair, and almost always wore dark pants and plaid shirts. He reminded me of a lumberjack. This guy had a bickering sense of humor and was very fair, and there was never a double standard with him on anything. During one of the few rare times we finished that period with a couple of minutes to spare, and everyone was chatting freely amongst themselves, I heard this girl go up front and ask him, why biology? As in why he has a passion for it, and why he decided to teach it. Then he tells her, "That's the thing that's great about biology. It's logical. It makes sense." And me, being the smart-ass kid I was at the time and counting down the days until I was done with this class, but liking much more the honors math class I was in, I blurted out, "That's why I like math!" And cue the record scratch cliche sound effect, and all the commotion in the classroom abruptly stops. People thought crap was about to hit the fan. After what felt like an eternity, he breaks the dead silence with his naturally loud, grisly voice and says, "Math is just like self-pleasuring for the brain. You just do it. You don't get anything from it. With biology, you get something from it." And years later, after graduating high school, I started slowly getting sick. After a while, I developed severe acid reflux, permanent insomnia, I stopped being able to sleep, involuntary muscle spasms, and weird, serious crap that made me make 11 fruitless ER visits. No one thought that this 2-centimeter cyst in the center of my brain that they saw in CTs and MRIs was responsible. Everyone thought it was mental, except the mental health doctor who asserted in no uncertain terms the opposite. Cue another sleepless 3 a.m., sudden body spaz out, being in constant pain, and sleep-deprived fatigue, and another fruitless ER visit where nothing was done. I decided to throw in the towel and escape from this hell. I just wanted rest, and I couldn't do that with whatever my condition was. I left a tear-soaked note in my apartment saying I went to take my life, and I explained why. I drove 400-plus miles to San Francisco to take my life on the Golden Gate Bridge. When I got there, I had an hour to kill before the Xanax and pain meds prescribed to me for my hellish condition would take effect. I took a bunch of both when I got on that bridge. I didn't want to be able to feel anything at all when I impacted the water. So I walked across the western walkway and the eastern walkway of that bridge, figuring that the cardiovascular activity would speed up the Xanax and pain pills kicking in, so I can leap off. I got lost in thought during that walk, and for some effing reason I remembered what my teachers said. And I thought to myself, it makes sense. This cyst is in the center of my brain on my pineal gland. That regulates my circadian rhythms and explains the insomnia. The optic nerve is right there too. It explains the visual disturbances I had. The insomnia explains the involuntary muscle spasms caused by permanent sleep deprivation. And my cyst being more than 3.5 times what's common and benign and asymptomatic explains why I am the exception rather than the rule. So, despite not a single doctor recommending brain surgery would fix any of this crap, it made sense to me why it would. I need brain surgery. But I thought that this isn't something to be taken lightly. I could die. It took me longer than I care to admit to realize that I'm on this bridge, waiting for these pain pills to fully kick in and numb me so I can peacefully leap to my death. And I'm worried about dying? F it. If brain surgery kills me, I wanted to die anyways. And if this fixes everything, then great. I drove several hundred miles back to my apartment, took matters into my own hands, and literally just emailed a brain surgeon's office in Los Angeles. And they actually called me back, told me that they gave my email to the surgeon, and he wants me to mail him CD-ROMs of my CT scans and MRIs. I did, and after reviewing them, he subsequently agreed to consult with me. I go up there and I see the brain surgeon, and this guy was impressed with my knowledge of what I'm getting myself into. The guy seems to see way too many nutcases, and fortunately, I wasn't one of them. He agreed to do the surgery after I would consult with an independent doctor there who would order some other studies on me and give me a second opinion. That doctor, after completing those studies and realizing I'm fully apprised of what I'm getting myself into, eventually signed off on the brain surgery, and the brain surgeon agreed to do it. That surgery was a you-know-what. No doctor believed the surgeon when he said I'd fully recover. I was a vegetable for months, but I did fully recover, and all my effing symptoms were gone. I'd subsequently and purely by happenstance find my biology teacher on Facebook under that People You May Know section, so I wrote him a long message explaining my whole story. It was like, hey, I'm this student who I heard you say that biology makes sense and math is like self-pleasuring for the brain. Yeah, about that. I remembered that when I went to take my life on the Golden Gate Bridge. And so, instead of taking my life, I walked off that bridge, went rogue, and emailed a brain surgeon who did the surgery, and it fixed everything. I also told him that as a big F you to all the doctors who said I wouldn't recover from the surgery and would be a bedridden vegetable for the rest of my life. I went skydiving on the 1-year anniversary of my surgery and sent that to the doctor who said, a full recover is a bit overly optimistic, and a picture of my overly optimistic ass fully recovered body in free fall with 2 thumbs up. I told him, like that brain surgery, the skydive also wasn't something I couldn't have done without that logic he praised about biology. I knew that after falling out of a plane at 120 miles per hour for a full minute, it would release endorphins like serotonin and dopamine, so that when I deployed the parachute, I, having had a terrifying fear of heights, wouldn't be freaking the F out that I'm a mile above the ground, that I'd be all happy and euphoric and all that. So, the message was like, yeah, I was about to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge to my death, but because of what I heard you say, I ended up going rogue, emailing a brain surgeon and going in for brain surgery and then going skydiving a year later. And I didn't hear from him for 3 years. I just let it go, thinking he thought, what the F is this, or who is this guy? And then I finally did hear from him. He hadn't checked his Facebook or messages in years and just now saw my message. He told me it was the most precious thing he ever received in his 35 years of teaching. He told me he saved my entire message, including my skydiving photo that I included at the bottom of that message, and he went somewhere, had it enlarged, printed, framed, and hung. So, out there somewhere, he has a hung picture of me skydiving in my letter thanking him for telling me that math is just like self-pleasuring for the brain, while biology is logical and makes sense. So, did anybody else get emotional listening to that story? Because I surely got a little emotional reading to it. I've been reading these stories for over a year now. That was one of my favorite ones. Every now and then they really get to me, and this was a beautiful story. And I also was not aware that permanent insomnia is a thing. That is, I can't even wrap my head around how horrible that must be. And I'm kind of baffled that all these medical professionals said, yeah, it's not that thing right there that's really big in your brain. Excuse me? I should not be reading a Reddit post thinking to myself, yeah, the doctor's wrong. No, the doctor should be correcting me. The doctor should be right. These people have degrees and vote and go grocery shopping, and they're ahead of you in traffic, causing huge traffic jams, and there's nothing you can do about it. These people are foolish and should be launched into the sun. Anyway, next story. Story number 36. Teacher abused me along with entire family. I was an overweight kid, and although I clearly told him I did not consent to being weighed in front of all the other fifth graders, more than 20, he still chose to violate my consent and led me to be absolutely viciously abused by my classmates. I dropped out at 16 due to health/severe disordered eating and burnout. It made me more open to abuse, but it was half as much if I didn't go to school. I can roundly place blame on Coach Satchwell for giving me severe and crippling social anxiety. The depression, low self-worth, and years of wanting to self-unalive issues are due to having no safe space and him disregarding a child's boundaries with their body. Same with my counselor who complained I wasn't applying myself when I disassociated for years on end. The school decided to take away my one joy in life, music, to teach me a lesson. My parents doubled down on the abuse, and so did the teachers till I burnt out. 94% on pre-SAT, 1390 SAT, 24 ACT. At 30, I'm disabled for mental health and a shut-in. I have all the ability to be a doctor or something great, but can't due to being failed by my home and my school support systems. I was a child doing the best to survive. F you, coach. Story number 37. Two things. 6th grade math teacher. At the end of the year, students were allowed to take a test to see if they could get into an advanced math class. I wasn't going to take the test because I didn't think I was good at math. I was getting a B, but due to family pressure, this didn't feel like a good grade to me at the time, and my teacher was surprised to find I didn't sign up since I was one of those teachers' pets in the front row, actually cares about school kind of kids. She talked me into signing up, and not only now am I still taking advanced classes in high school, but it's also not just math anymore. I definitely wouldn't have done any of that had she not spoken to me. And then the second one, 8th grade, different math teacher. There was a math-based competition, and apparently getting out of 6th hour class wasn't enough of an incentive since only 2 people signed up. So she told us she would buy us a full-sized candy bar to anyone that signed up. Didn't matter the score. 3 more people, myself included, signed up. A lot of the students said she was just trying to get people to sign up and she'd hope we'd forgot, but she made good on her word. Even had us write down what candy we wanted. She also helped me work through my fear of failure and spoke to my parents about the pressure I seemed to put myself under. Story number 38. When I was in the 5th grade, we had a substitute teacher. He was a young black male, and I wasn't used to seeing male teachers at that point. He was subbing for Miss Alderman at Westview Elementary in Miami. He had a math problem on the chalkboard and had asked for volunteer students to come up and solve the problem. A few students went up and had gotten it wrong. I mustered the courage to go up and try, and after writing the answer, I turned around and he had his hand up. I was confused and started walking back to my seat and noticed he was asking for a high five because I had gotten the correct answer. Well, I gave him a high five, and I remembered how that one incident boosted my self-confidence and my self-respect. I didn't grow up with my father, so that moment with the substitute teacher might have been fleeting, but it was pivotal for a 9-year-old boy. I always refer back to that moment as a defining moment that helped me propel into getting a bachelor's and master's degree and using it to work with children with developmental delays and disabilities. I understood then that the actions of another, no matter how small, can be the world to someone else. Story number 39. First ever post and on my phone. A bit of a backstory. I was in 2nd grade, so between 2002-2003, so I was between ages 8 or 9. I was behind in my English class, so I would be taken out of the classroom and go to a separate classroom to work on my ELA. Remedial lessons, I think. Anyway, the teacher, she wasn't even a teacher yet, she didn't like how I wrote my Ks. My lowercase k looked like my uppercase K. She kept yelling at me about how my handwriting was wrong and that how my mom was teaching me wrong. I went back to the classroom crying. I'm pretty sure my mom made a hailstorm when I told her, and I never had to go see that teacher again. My mom was working full-time, going to school full-time, paying for an entire house worth of bills, and raising 3 kids. So I'm quite fond of the times when she would be exhausted from work and school and still try to help me with learning how to read and write. F you, Mrs. Izzo. I still write my Ks the same way. Story number 40. I will use his damn name because he taught me to believe in my writing. Mr. Popovich. I failed a semester of junior English because the teacher was an effing boring, uninspired, and should have been retired old lady. No writing prompts, no direction or correction. Just that's wrong, this is wrong. I don't agree with this or that. Terrible teacher, burnt out in general. Probably not her fault. I was in high school and I know how high schoolers are. But Mr. Papo was different. He didn't mind if you spoke from truth, from the soul. He'd give us a prompt of, what would you bring to a deserted island if you were to be stranded for years, sans food and water? He made me comfortable enough to tell the truth in my writing instead of making crap up. He changed the whole game for me. He didn't judge me for saying I'd probably want cigarettes and lighters, probably a lot of booze for the boredom and loneliness. He didn't question my choices, but embraced the fact that I was being honest in my writing. After I aced his class, he requested for me to be a TA the following year, which made up an elective English credit I missed junior year. The only condition was that I help keep the other kids engaged in the lesson by being outlandish and honest. Also, a lot of peer review. Like, a lot of peer review. I read everything the other 30 kids in that class wrote. I learned about other people, and it made me a much better man than I would have turned out to be. Oh, and I got to take roll call. Sit down, take your seat, do this and that. Also, please ignore my own mistakes, or don't nicely. I'm drunk right now. Story number 41. This isn't a feel-good story. I was in the 8th grade and I was passing a note in the hallway to another student. The teacher intercepted it. I got worried, but also a little hopeful. The note discussed the abuse I dealt with at home, my alcoholic dad, my crazy mom, how the drinking led to hitting me, the hours of emotional abuse I dealt with every day while my dad drunkenly berated me because that's just what he did. She read it, the whole note, and I guess she felt the recipient, another 8th grader, should have received it in lieu of her intercepting what she thought was a note about which teen heartthrob was your favorite. But she gave it to him and said, I intercepted this and it was meant for you, and she handed it to him. I wrote that note wanting to feel heard. She took that note and I felt worried, then hopeful I might find help in her inception. When she gave it back to him, she never spoke of its contents ever again, and it was then that I felt defeat. She had diary-esque accounts of my life at home, and she did nothing. Good, bad, or ugly, I learned that I was on my own. Story number 42. My high school science teacher. Small-ass town, total of like 30 kids in my graduating class. She and I would butt heads all the time. She was what I would consider to be old and crotchety, and I'm sure she thought I was just another punk a-hole. We frequently disagreed on damn near everything. Example, I once asked her in class why we had 2 different words with the same definition, inflammable versus flammable. Both mean easy to catch fire. She argued that they meant 2 different things, obviously opposite definitions, and I disagreed because it wasn't true. She grabbed a dictionary in the middle of class, dropped it on my desk, and asked me to look up definitions for both words while we continued class. I looked them up, read them out loud, and she had to look them up afterwards just to confirm that she was in fact wrong. Admittedly, she openly stated in front of the class that she was wrong and apologized, and I wasn't a good student. I was constantly failing most of my classes. I just didn't give a crap. I kept getting pushed through each grade anyways, until my senior year. Got told by my principal that it didn't matter if I pulled a miracle out of my ass, that I wouldn't be graduating on time. But I did it. I managed to make 17 credits happen in my senior year while doing track, cheerleading for 2 seasons, and my senior project, and passed everything. The science teacher went out of her way to petition the school board to make a new school award to be given annually, specifically for me. She called it the Comeback Kid Award. I had no idea she had done that until the end of the year award ceremony that our school did every year. Surprised the crap out of me and my class, because it didn't exist before that point. Rest in peace, Mrs. Zychek. You showed me that some people do care about those of us who fall through the cracks of the system. You proved to me that my efforts were not in vain and were in fact noticed. You weren't my favorite, but in the end, you earned my ultimate respect. Story number 43. Pretty late, but whatever. A couple of things. All different teachers, most bad, but one really, really good. When I was 12, I told my teacher that I wanted to hurt myself. I was pretty depressed at that point, and instead of telling my mother or trying to help me or really doing anything, she just made me go play Yahtzee with the other students. For context, I was in an ASD unit in secondary school, and most of my classes were 1-on-1 or 1-on-3 or 4. I had 2 mainstream classes. One teacher asked me if I had a crush on my friend in class one day. Luckily, it was just the 2 of us, but then yelled at us in a cafe to stop holding hands under the table. We weren't. We were slapping each other's hands because we were stupid teenagers. That same teacher, along with another one, were talking to me about school because I was so stressed and not going to school. I went mute because I was so overwhelmed, and they used that to their advantage. They asked me if there was anything I liked about school, and asked if I liked my friends. I nodded. They said, "So, you don't like your friends?" and were using my silence to put words in my mouth. So I stormed out of the room and went to my desk. They followed me and spoke to me in front of me saying, "I think that was very rude and immature, don't you, teacher two?" And I do think that was rude and immature, teacher one. But a really nice story is when I was super stressed in either second or third year and had scribbled on my arm in pen form as a form of, well, and I went to geography class, which was just me and the teacher. When she asked how I was, I just showed her my arm and said not that well. And instead of shrugging it off and making me do work anyway, she turned on Netflix, Blue Planet to be specific. She knew I loved it, and spoke to me the entire class about how I don't need to worry about the future and classes and stuff. Said stuff like I could start doing a college course and hate the subject at any point down the line, and I could just quit and start over again. That I have control over my life, and it's just important I do what makes me happy. I left after my exams in third year and never saw her again, but I hope she saw I got an A in geography because she was an amazing teacher, and I hope I made her proud. Story number 44. I was in math class, really great teacher, always ready to answer questions and explain things in a different way until his students got a hold of the topic. I think we were working on factoring trinomials, and the phrase for remembering one of the steps was add them outside, meaning God knows what it was years ago, but this phrase is very important because my name is Adam, phonetically the same to add them. So there's 16-year-old me spacing out thinking about BJ's when Mr. T calls on me, and he says, Adam outside. And I look up, blank stare, what had I done? And I say to him, what? Adam, outside. And he's vaguely pointing in the direction of the board at this time, which happens to be the direction of the door as well. I'm shook. Reality is broke. No idea what I did. I'm looking around for help. Nothing. I say, why? And Mr. T is upset at this, and he raises his voice, Adam, outside. And I say, okay, but I have no idea what I did wrong. I proceed to get up from my desk and walk towards the door. And he says, Adam, where are you going? And I say, you just told me to go outside. Then it clicks, and class is ruined for the day as everyone realizes what just happened and absolutely pisses themselves for the next 30 minutes of class. Ended up being one of the best math classes I ever had, and I'm sure Mr. T still tells students that story. I couldn't help but laugh by just typing this out. Story number 45. My history teacher in high school was my elementary school gym teacher, Mrs. C. On the first test of the year, the very top in the middle of the instructions on the page says, just for reading this simple text, turn in your test for 100%. So I stood up and walked it over to turn it in after only a few minutes, and she looked down and acted like she was writing stuff on the pages and winked at me, loudly proclaiming, well, we got a real smarty pants right here in class, already finished all 3 pages and everything is correct. And I got so many weird stares for the next few weeks. Only myself and another classmate figured it out, and that she did this on 3 out of 5 tests, always hiding this instruction anywhere she could. Flash forward to the end of the semester, and she writes our test scores for the whole semester on the chalkboard, laughs and says that classmate and myself to come up and do the final test as a brain battle between the 2 top testers in the class. The test looked normal, but all the capital letters on it spelled out, Mrs. C knows the best way to teach about histories. Say it out loud. So I did, and she clapped and told us that out of all 32 students in the class, only 2 had figured out how to read the instructions and open our minds to the riddles of this world. The other girl had said out loud, say Mrs. C is the best teacher of the history, but we both got 100% anyway. It just always stands out to me as one of the only things I remember from high school, outside of theater and swim team. Story number 46. It was Friday, and I was in grade 3. We had a science test on Monday, and our teacher made sure everyone was going to study for it. She wrote it on the board. She reminded us. She made us all write it in our agendas. Anyway, I forgot the textbook on my desk when I left school that Friday, so I never studied for it. When I came in on Monday, she took me aside and said, Moose, did you study for your science test today? To which I replied like a stupid effing 9-year-old and said, yes, miss. And her eyes narrowed, and she said, how did you study if you left your textbook here all weekend? As she pointed to my desk to the book sitting on it all innocently giving me away. I didn't say anything, and she followed up with, Moose, if you don't get 100% on this test, you're going to be in detention for the entire week. Well, I got 100% on that test. My mom told me years later that during her parent-teacher interview that the teacher told her the story. She said she was so pissed off with me that she wanted to punish me for lying so badly, never thinking that I'd actually get 100% on the test, but when I did, she couldn't do anything. Story number 47. I was 12 or 13 when this happened. We used to have a huge playground outside our school. During the school hours, we used to play there, and after school hours, the ground was used by parents and school buses to pick up their children. That day, my father was supposed to pick me up, and he was late. I was just running around with a bunch of kids. I didn't see a vehicle coming from behind me, and out of fear, I jumped to the side and something stabbed into my thigh. I sat there bleeding for 2 minutes. I mean, we were all kids and didn't know what to do. Then I see one teacher running towards me, picked me up and carried me to his car and removed the piece of metal from my leg and stopped the bleeding. I blacked out in his car after that. I woke up in the ER later in the evening. My parents were in the room and I asked what had happened. Apparently, I had lost a lot of blood, and the teacher saved me by donating his blood. My school was big, with 1,000 students and more than 150 teachers. I never saw him again. I didn't remember his face in the 2 minutes that I saw him before blacking out, and whenever I see my scar, I remember him and always pray for him. Story number 48. I unfortunately cannot remember his name, but my 6th grade year I had one of the most amazing teachers I've ever had. He was the only one in the entire school to support me and have faith in me. I had lunch and then athletics before his class, and oh how tired I often was. Anyways, my mother is a huge history buff, going to school for American history and the Civil War and whatnot, so his class was a breeze. Eventually, he'd let me put my head down and sleep in his class because I did so well. One day, this one other student in the class decided that she wanted to lay her head down and rest as well, so she snapped at him, snarking, "How come OP gets to lay his head down and sleep all the time in your class?" And the teacher just asked a question along the lines of if anyone knew what major battles happened in the 3 major wars America had between the 1800s and early 1900s, being the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. And I popped my head up after a few minutes of silence and dead ass listed about 5 of them before he looked back at the student and whipped back with, "That's why." Hands down, one of the coolest and best teachers I've ever had. Story number 49. I had just gotten to grade 7 in a new school and had been devouring books at an almost unhealthy rate. My vocabulary was a bit larger than average at the time, and I was already interested in creative writing. My English teacher assigned us the task of writing short stories, so I was excited to flex my writing skills and wrote some pretty cool stories. I didn't find it easy to pay attention in class, so I did the work at home and brought it in the next day. After having gone over my stories, she calls me up to her desk and starts asking me if I was the one who wrote those stories. I told her I did, but she kept insisting that I must have gotten help or had someone older write it for me. This was making me uncomfortable, and she didn't seem to want to let it go until I admitted something, so I told her that I got help. She seemed satisfied with that answer and told me to write another 3 short stories. I did so and intentionally dumbed it down so she wouldn't harass me again. Fast forward to a larger assignment a month later where we have to write a longer story. I was chafing at having to dumb my work down for her to accept that I wrote it, so I went all out and wrote as well as I could, using metaphors and whatever else I felt like. The night after I submitted it, she calls my home and accuses me of cheating to my parents. I don't have a good relationship with my parents, so I don't defend myself to anyone because I just want to be left alone. In the end, she never believed that I was a talented writer. I was never placed in the advanced English classes. My desire to write took a big hit, and I'll forever hate that teacher for being so insistent on me being an idiot instead of giving me a chance to flourish. Story number 50. My teacher made me hate math. I've always been good at math because I genuinely enjoy it. I like the logic behind it, the sense of organized thought, and you can get to an answer if you follow the formula. I love understanding and figuring out how you get from point A to point B. Math problems were like puzzles with the key code given to you, so I thoroughly enjoyed the subject and was excelling at it. But this teacher had a personal hatred of me because my personality didn't go with her old school Catholic dictatorship style. I was vocal with my disdain of her methods, which can be summed up with, "If you don't get it, you're just being dumb," and her obvious favoritisms in class. I got suspended for insubordination and accused of cheating a lot of times when I didn't, letting people copy off of me. Even the other teachers had known about our nemesis status in school. She even looked like the most hated fictional teacher of all time, Dolores Umbridge. She dressed like her and talked like her and had that weird psycho smirk when she passive-aggressively verbally attacked you. Now, I saw Harry Potter as an adult, and when I saw Umbridge in the movie, I suddenly realized that after high school, I repressed and avoided anything to do with math because I hated it so much. In turn, I became a bit dumb at even the most basic calculations like addition. People even teased me, going, "Aren't Asians supposed to be good at math?" when I go blank at how much change I should get at the cash register. As an adult now, I've contemplated sending her a letter to tell her about my experience being under her for 3 years, and how she ruined one of the great subjects I enjoyed learning. I want her to be aware of how much impact she can have on young students with her whiny ways. F you, teacher. Now I'm the Asian who gets confused at how I should split the bill during a date. Story number 51. I kid you not, in 7th grade, my health teacher tried to settle a fight I was having with my best friend at the time. Not a physical fight, but just one of those "I'm not talking to you for a week" kind of fights. I didn't want to continue talking to the girl because I found her a bit obnoxious and clingy, and I told that to my teacher. Anyway, my teacher's bright idea was to conduct a poll in our all-female health class of who people in the class would rather be friends with, either me or my friend. The teacher's logic was that she would tally up the votes afterwards and she would know for herself who people preferred, and thus who was probably a better friend. So yeah, she announced the poll in class and everyone had to write down on a piece of paper who they preferred. Luckily, she never announced the winner in class. Still, it was honestly traumatic. I'm 23 now and it still makes me cringe when I think back at it. Watching our mutual friends have to decide between the two of us, people coming up to me or her afterwards to say that they voted for one of us, hearing girls gossip afterwards about the reason they chose her over me or vice versa, I'll never forget that day or that teacher or that school. You know, it's stories like this that just allow me to remember that teachers are also people, and people are incredibly stupid sometimes. But the worst part, the most tragic part, is that people who are stupid are unfortunately put in positions of power over other people. That's the really scary part. And when that happens, what are you left to do? Vote them out? Protest? Write a letter? No. You become stupider than them and then you get put in charge. Honestly, it's a genius idea if it weren't so stupid. Anyway, next story. Story number 52. I grew up poor. I imagine it was pretty obvious to anyone who knew me, but I was just a kid living life and never thought much of it. In 5th grade, I got the one teacher every student feared, Miss Penland. She was said to be a terrifying old woman and students were always afraid of her punishments. Supposedly, she one time threw a kid out of a window. Elementary school stories, am I right? Well, we'd have snack time every day at around 10 a.m. I obviously couldn't afford something like that. I couldn't even afford lunch, thank God for free lunch, so I'd just sit there and read while other students snacked. One day, I came to class and found a bag in my chair with my name on it. I opened it and found a crap ton of amazing snacks, Oreos, those little cheese and cracker packs, fruit, you name it. It was something different almost every day. Miss Penland said, "Don't worry about it, and there'd always be a bag for me." I was so grateful and excited to see what snacks she'd give me each day, and she made sure I got them even on the days she was away. That year at Christmas, she came to see me at home. She brought a gigantic trash bag loaded with toys for me and my brother. It was the most incredible thing I could ever imagine. It was easily quadruple the amount of gifts I had ever gotten up to that point. I remember hugging her as tightly as I could because I didn't know what to say. After I got to middle school, I went back to visit her a couple of times just because I missed her. But she transferred schools and I lost touch with her. I never saw her again. I want to thank her for all she did for me, but this was many years ago now. She was an older woman and I don't think she's still around. I know though that she knows how grateful I am and that I continue to do my best to share what she gave me. Story number 53. Bit of context. In the UK, not sure of other countries, we tend to have a homework diary in high school and secondary school to record assignments for the week, which is then meant to be signed off by parents to say that they have ensured the work is done. My head of year in high school was a total ass. Typical power trip sort of guy who was more concerned with punishing students than actually teaching. He used to come around personally and check homework planners were signed. On one occasion, he got to me and lost his crap because a couple of weeks in, mine weren't signed off. I explained to him that my single father was working 12-hour shifts, often 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. So in between being at school, actually doing my homework, and my dad going to work, we often didn't see each other to go over the planner. I asked the head to check with my teachers as they could confirm that there were no issues with my homework. He continued to lose his crap and ask who was in the house with me if my dad was at work. Answer, my 16-year-old brother. It was at this point he started threatening to ring social services as I did not have a proper guardian watching me at home, which I'm pretty sure is bull for a 16-year-old sibling in the UK. To finish off, he told me I would be receiving after-school detentions for every day my planner was not signed off. So I did the sensible thing when I got home that day and told my dad everything that had been said to me. Without saying a word, he was in the car and driving to the school before his shift. About 30 minutes later, he essentially says to me, "You don't have detention anymore, and don't worry about it." The next day, the a-hole teacher pulls me out of class to sheepishly apologize and just ask me that I keep on top of homework, which I already did, and basically never spoke to me again for the rest of high school. I never did find out what my dad said to him that day, but considering he is a bitterly divorced lifelong military man, I imagine it would have been fun to watch. Story number 54. I'm a girl on my friend's throwaway account. When I was in high school, I had this one chemistry teacher who was young and absolutely brilliant. He was an awesome teacher and really helped me understand the material. I'll call him Mr. H. But he literally saved my life one day. I was wearing a skirt in the lab. I had a lab coat on, but it wasn't long enough to cover my legs, and I was horsing around and being stupid. And a flask fell off a shelf, broke on a table, and acid splashed all over me. I was stupid and never buttoned up the lab coat. It was was all over my shirt and skin, and before I knew anything, Mr. H had me by the arm and dragged me across the room under the emergency shower. He was yelling at everyone to get out of the lab. He pulled my clothes off down to my underwear and bra. I was so embarrassed and kind of angry at him. He made me stay under the shower for like 20 minutes while he threw my clothes into a sink. I got sent home after that. A whole big ordeal was made out of it, obviously, and I ended up having some minor burns on my legs. After an investigation and everything was relatively normal, a month or so later, we had a sub for a little bit. I noticed how badly burned his hands were, and I cried. He talked to me after class, and I thanked him so much. And a little later, I asked him if he was investigated for taking my clothes off. He said he was, and that he didn't care. He said, "I'd rather be accused of something I didn't do and be jobless than let any one of my students get hurt." And we never talked about it again, and I never saw him after high school. But wherever you are, thank you, Mr. H. I love you. Story number 55. I had an English teacher in high school who completely changed the way I thought of myself. I hated school and was a good at tests but never does homework kind of student. I came close to not graduating. A lot of it was social anxiety and insecurity, but I didn't realize until years later. I had this teacher sophomore year, but asked her for a college recommendation letter when I was a senior. She wrote the most eloquent and encouraging words I'd ever heard about myself, that I was a natural leader with the kind of quiet intellect that most people wish they had. I cried when I read it. She also more or less told me afterwards that I needed to stop giving a crap what people thought about me and have the confidence to do what I want. She said confidence was like a pearl. It starts as a tiny piece of sand that nudges at you until you realize you need to make a change. And then you keep building upon it every chance you get. True confidence doesn't happen overnight, and that's okay. The whole experience couldn't have happened at a more needed moment in my life. Story number 56. Sophomore year of high school, so 2001 to 2002, my algebra teacher was especially awful. I had been in algebra since 7th grade because I seriously sucked and suck at that kind of math. I never understood anything, and I was in a class with a bunch of upperclassmen for some reason I can't remember. Anyways, I would regularly get wrong answers on my homework and tests to the point of having a D in the class consistently. Now, I don't know why my grade offended him so much, but he would regularly call on me knowing I wouldn't know the answer. He seemed to get some sick enjoyment out of it. At the same time, my family was going through some personal crap with my dad, so things were not stable at home. Well, one day he calls on me, and then before I can answer, he says, "Let me guess, you don't know, and probably because you didn't even do the homework." To which everyone laughed at me, and I fought back tears of embarrassment because I genuinely did try my hardest. That day, I went home and told my mom about what happened. She knew all about the times he was calling on me, and this was the last straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. She was livid. The next morning, she called out of work, branch manager for a big bank, and came to my school to meet with the vice principal. We sat down and I examined what had happened. The VP called the teacher out of his class to come down and have a talk. When he walked in, my heart was racing. He entered with a smile, probably thinking he'd done something worthy of an award, until he saw me, then my mom. The VP recounted my story, and he said, "I didn't call her out, but she doesn't do her homework." To which my mother, the goddess that she is, stood up in his face and said, "I've watched my daughter struggle through algebra for years now, and she sits at the dinner table every night working for hours on your homework." And at this point, the VP had seen and heard enough and asked us to go ahead and step out of the office so she could have a word with them. She told him to take a seat, and as she closed the door, I saw his face look horrified. We listened just outside the door. She told him he can't call out students for any reason, and even if I wasn't doing my homework, that's no reason to cause me such embarrassment and stress that he was to leave me alone. After this, he never spoke to me again. I was still in his class, but he wouldn't even so much as look at me. About a month later, we had moved out of town, and I was on my last day of school at that high school, and I had to have every teacher sign me out. When I went up to his desk to have him sign the paper releasing me, he took it from me and looked at me for the first time in a month and said, "You're leaving?" I nodded, for which he took as an opportune moment to once again try to demean me by saying, "Why should I sign this? You don't even do anything." So I took my power back, and I said, "If you don't, I'll have my mother come down here and speak to the vice principal again." And his face fell, and he dipped his head down, and he signed the paper. After taking the paper to the office with all of my signatures, I walked out of that hellhole with my head held high. On the flip side of that, at my new high school, my algebra teacher was the kindest man ever. I came to that school in the middle of the semester, and everyone knew I was brand new to the school because there were only 900 students in the whole school. Well, after a week of me failing at homework and quizzes, he told me to stay behind after class one day. My anxiety immediately started to rise by the time everyone had left. I had tears flooding my eyes and was shaking. He sat down in the desk next to me and asked me if everything was okay. He noticed I wasn't doing well in the work and wondered if I was struggling because I didn't understand understand. At that moment, I realized he was the exact opposite of my previous math teacher, and my tears broke free. He felt so bad thinking he'd upset me, and I explained to him the trauma caused by my previous teacher and how I really don't understand any of this, and I'd been in algebra since 7th grade. At that moment, he knew exactly what had been happening to me and how he wanted to help. He told me that I could come in at lunchtime every day because his class was always open, and other kids who were great at math were in there every day, and they all could help me. My first time in there at lunch, I was nervous and shy, but once lunch was over and class had started, I felt more at ease and had started to understand things better. I kept coming in at lunch for the rest of the year, and on my first big test, I got a B+. He held back my test results until the very end and told me to come up to his desk after class. When class was over, he said, "I kept your test because I wanted to personally tell you how proud I am of you and all that you've worked so hard to accomplish," and turned my test around for me to see, and I started crying tears of joy and did a happy dance. I thanked him so much for all of his support and guidance, and when that year ended, I went back to his class at the end of the day and thanked him again. I ended up with a B+ in the class, and it was the best feeling in the world. So, if you ever see this, Mr. Pear, you were and are a great example of how a teacher should react and act towards their students. Thank you again. Story number 57. When I was 5, I stole a bunch of candy bars from the staff room at school. They were in one of those honest box type things, and I was a kid who just wanted some chocolate, so I just took them. The principal yelled at me, and I cried a lot because I really liked him and I felt awful for what I did. But I learned my lesson, and I still liked him after that. He wasn't the one teacher. Whenever there was an assembly, some kids would be chosen to clear away the tables and chairs in the staff room. After I took the chocolate, I remember volunteering, and my teacher, and by the way, my mom thinks he was racist. I was the only brown kid in my school in a very white town, but I don't know. But anyway, he declined my offer as I couldn't be trusted. Mind you, this was months after the incident, and I never got to do the task again. Some teacher made me write 40 lines at morning tea, 20 minutes, and if I didn't, which I obviously couldn't, I was 5 years old, it was doubled at lunch. So I had to write, "I will not slam my desk" 80 times within 40 minutes, when I was supposed to be eating because I had accidentally dropped the lid of my desk once. It wasn't even that loud, and everyone in the class did it often enough that it was clear he was just picking on me. So F you, Mr. Hepburn. I'm glad you went bald, you shiny head, ugly ass MF. Story number 58. I usually get extremely nervous when I take exams, and sometimes that translates in stupid mistakes because I'm not focused enough. After I had finished one particularly long and difficult exam, I started talking about it with my classmates, and I realized I had literally missed a whole question. I was supposed to answer 2 out of 3 options, and I only answered 1, so I thought I would get a really bad grade. The following day, I got an email from my teacher saying, "Hi, I noticed that you missed a question on the exam, and I was really surprised because apart from that, the rest of the exam was flawless. Care to tell me what happened? Was it a time thing?" I was freaking out, honestly, and told him the truth, which was that I was so nervous I misread the whole thing and didn't realize I had to answer that one too. He gave me like an 8-hour deadline and told me that if I wanted to, I could turn in the answer to the last question and it wouldn't have any effect on my final mark. I almost cried. It was stressful, but I managed to write a pretty nice answer and turn it in time, and I ended up getting a 10 out of 10. I couldn't thank him enough. He was the sweetest. Story number 59. Okay, so this needs some backstory. One day I was going home from school in the bus when I was in 2nd grade and playing with some kids. One girl decides to come up to me and starts beating me with her pencil box. I was in the back seat and half laid down when she was beating me with her box, so I decided to snatch her box from her and throw it a bit far away to the next seat. I was not able to see where I was throwing it because she was blocking my vision and I was half laid down on the seat. Well, it went right out the window, and she got mad at me for throwing her box for saving myself from her, which I didn't even intend, and asks me to buy her a new pencil box. And I didn't have much money to buy her a new box, so I decided to clean my older box, which took me 2 hours to clean as I clean every pencil stain with my eraser, and I give that to her the next day. She didn't say anything at that point and took it. But in the lunch break, I was called into another section in which that girl used to study, and the teacher, whom I didn't even know, decided to make a decision of what the girl told her and made me stand in front of the whole class embarrassed and beated me with a stick in front of 60 students whom I didn't even know without even asking me if I did that mistake. I went to class crying, and I was a really shy and introverted kid. And my class teacher asks me, and he was my favorite teacher by the way, what happened? And I just couldn't say anything and kept crying and didn't speak to anyone for many days and was traumatized by teachers in that school for many years. And now, whenever I think of that teacher, I just feel like confronting her and telling her what she did to me was wrong. Story number 60. He made us participate in a psychological experiment. At the beginning of class one day, he walked into the room and picked up our last assignment. He told us he was incredibly disappointed and that our work wasn't crap, it was garbage, and proceeded to throw our papers into the trash and walk out of the room. We sat there absolutely stunned, and a few of my classmates started crying from the shock, and one even started having a panic attack. He came back, yelled at us some more, and left again. This whole time I was completely shocked, repeating over and over, "This isn't real, right? This is some sort of prank, right?" He came back in a few minutes later and sat down to explain himself. Turns out, a few of my classmates were in psychology and had asked him to help them with an experiment. The experiment was to see what we would do when faced with someone in power acting aggressive and sort of abusing their power. He told us that he felt really bad about it, to the point that he brought us donuts on Monday the next week. And he told us he could barely sleep because he felt so guilty about it. Well, it became a bit of an inside joke in the class for the rest of the school year. This was in 12th grade. All right, look, I don't approve of what he did, and clearly he felt guilty, and he most likely apologized, but like, donuts? Really? What kind? Because I'm just saying, like, if you hit me with your car and there's donuts or ice cream at the end of this rainbow, I'm probably going to forgive you. If I have my legs and my arms and all 20 digits, 21 actually, then you know what? We're cool, we're good, me and my stomach like you. Next story. Story number 61. I was viciously abused both at home and at school. It got to the point I was followed home having rocks thrown at me, getting into fistfights, etc. My science teacher, Mrs. Wax, my savior hippie mom I never had, she would drive me home after school, give me food, ask me about what's been happening. I am forever in her debt for her acts of kindness and generosity. She genuinely believed I was capable of significantly more than I was being given credit for. And she was right. I'm smarter than most people in the room, and I never finished school. I would still sleep through classes and be able to get past tests with A's and B's. But that didn't matter. They still compared me to the Unabomber. But none of that mattered to her. She only saw the best in me. And funny enough, she was the most hated teacher in school for her harsh discipline and strict by-the-book rules. Which was weird given how very hippie she was after work. I guess she really did take her job seriously. Thank you, Mrs. Wax. Story number 62. I wasn't expecting so many of these to be positive things, so I'll give a mix. 1. In second grade math class, we had a word problem test. This was before kids were tested for things like dyslexia, which I had, so I effed up putting the answers in the correct places on the answer sheet. The teacher graded the papers right away, came up to me, death gripped my arm, shoved a paper with a huge F on it in my face, and she asked me what was wrong with me and told me I'd be staying through playground to retake the test. I'll never forget the humiliation and shame. Number 2, I had a teacher in 7th grade that was again my teacher in 9th. She was really into meeting all students' learning styles, visual, auditory, tactile. Like, she would give her lecture with overhead projections of the notes and would make us copy all her notes and learn shorthand. She also gave really clear grading sheets for projects which would basically say, if you want to C, do this and that. If you want to B, do this and that and the other thing, etc. And she would do 2 versions of the project, one creative and one written that we would choose from. So we have a Holocaust project where we have to create a journal of someone's perspective during that time. I pour myself into this journal of a test subject of Dr. Mendel. I coffee dyed the pages and put photos and scraps. I even included a letter my grandfather wrote of his experience freeing Dachau, and her grading paper saying it was the most beautiful project she had ever seen, and praised me for the whole thing. The reinforcement that my creativity was just as worthy as the students who were good at math or test taking is something I'll never forget. Story number 63. I was in Air Force ROTC all of high school as an elective course. It was a really fun class ran by 2 retired Air Force veterans. To be an ROTC, you had to have a passing grade. My sophomore year, Colonel Swan approached me and told me that if I didn't get my math grade up, I would be kicked out. I almost started to cry. I'd kept asking the math teacher for help. He'd tell me I didn't pay enough attention in class, and he didn't waste his time on lazy students. I took extra notes and tried hard, but I couldn't grasp the material. The numbers and steps just got all out of order. I would break down during tests. I felt so stupid and frustrated. I explained this. Then Colonel Swan asked when my study hall and lunch was. Then he told me he would help tutor me on one of my study halls. He took it slow, and we figured out how to make the math steps more memorable. I went from an F to a B. I wouldn't have graduated high school without his help. I can't even explain just how immeasurable his help was. He was so patient and never got upset if I wasn't grasping the problem. problem, we would redo things as many times as I needed. I was diagnosed with Asperger's and dyscalculia shortly after I graduated, and I wish I would have been diagnosed sooner. Another one with Colonel Swan was also my sophomore year. Once a week was uniform day, and I never missed uniform before. My mom was in the hospital after self-unaliving attempt 2 nights before. She was in stable condition, but she was being moved to a mental hospital. I was rushed out from home to my dad's house and missed school the day before. I was too shaken to have even thought of grabbing my uniform. I had ROTC first period. I sat in the front row, I was a nervous wreck, and started doodling instead of paying attention. Colonel called me in his little office and immediately wanted to know what was going on because I wasn't acting right. I was a very attentive student normally, not to mention again, I never missed uniform day. I remember bawling my eyes out. The floodgates of all the pent-up stress just broke loose. We talked all period, and after the bell rang, he waited for all the other students to clear out, then walked me to the counselor's office so my classmates wouldn't see that I'd been crying. He was the absolute best. And honestly, I don't think any of my other instructors cared about all of us students as much as he did. Story number 64. She figured out I had dyscalculia, which is essentially dyslexia with numbers. I hated math so much because usually math teachers are just the most abusive jerks. They all acted as if I was messing up just to spite them or something, as if I enjoyed doing poorly. This math teacher, though, realized it was kind of strange that I was getting such weird answers even though when she asked me, I understood in theory what I was supposed to be doing. The numbers were just always wrong. Turns out I was mixing them up in my head. She had been doing that awful thing where they just stand over you while you work and stare. It made me so nervous, but she was watching me writing numbers backwards or in the wrong order or just not at all. I didn't even notice I was doing it. I'm thinking I'm writing down a 6 and I write a 9 instead. Story number 65. I was in 6th grade. I was playing the piano and had been playing for several years. We were split into groups of 4 for a class play. Each group had a scene that was kind of a mini plot by itself, and I was in charge of music for my group. Rather than pulling a generic CD and turning the music down and up at the right time, I pulled music that I knew how to play that fit the mood of each interlude. I timed the pieces, played them, and my mom helped me record it on a cassette. It was the early 90s, and I didn't have the tech to burn a CD with tracks. It took hours, but I was proud of the work I put in. As we rehearsed, my teacher got angry that I had to rewind and fast forward the tape to track to the right music. She said to me, "I don't know why you had to do it this way. Why couldn't you do it right like your classmates?" And she sent me to sit in the audience with the other non-participating groups. The next day, I came back in with a CD and did it the way my better classmates did. Miss Antonelli, I'm not even sure if that spelling is right, well and truly F you for power tripping on humiliating an 11-year-old. You were a female dog and you were the worst bully I have ever encountered. And that's saying something, as I was bullied mercilessly for years. You didn't do a crap to protect me from that either. Edit. I felt I should add a nice one too. In college, I struggled with physics, and my professor knew I was trying. I practically lived in his office during office hours asking questions, trying to understand why a formula applied instead of just rote memorization to pass the exams. He took an interest in my goals. He learned I played piano and came to one of my college recitals. I was shocked. He was so kind. On one exam, I scored a 9. We went through the exam in detail that afternoon after class. I had flipped a sign in a base formula, and if I hadn't done that, I'd have gotten an A on the exam. At the end of the term, he set the curve for a B- to be my grade. That's what I needed to score to keep my scholarship with the rest of my courses considered. I will never forget that. Dr. Glosser recognized that I was doing my absolute best, so he gave me what I needed to be able to keep going. Story number 66. UConn undergrad political science. Had a professor who was both tenured and into actual teaching. She promised we, the class, would learn at least one thing in every class. One day, she comes in and realizes she has a meeting with an editor, so this will have to be quick. She creates a scenario on the board of different school departments: math, English, PE, art, music, etc. She provides an amount for each class in terms of budget and assigns a relative scale of how well the students are doing in each class. Math is great and costs $2 million. English is 50-50, failing and costs $2.5 million. Gym, art, etc. costs pennies. She then asks the class to reduce the spending by 50%. Every student took money from math and gave it to English. We threw money at the problem. What was the math department's incentive for doing well next year? What was the English department's incentive to do better next year? We, the students, thought we knew exactly what we were collectively doing, and we screwed the pooch. Story number 67. I fell asleep in French class in 7th grade. First class of the day, on a Thursday, I was 13, and my teacher called home and told my mom I must be on drugs because I fell asleep in her class. My mom lost her crap. It kicked off literally a decade of physical and emotional abuse, of being called a junkie and a WHO word, threats of being kicked out, completely isolated at home except for going to school, and even then sometimes forced to stay home, spreading rumors about me so that my friends would abandon me and their parents would condemn me, locked into rooms, tapped down to chairs, of being hit and pushed and grabbed, hair pulled, slammed into walls. When she started to figure out I was gay, that was blamed on drugs too. Years of horrific homophobic harassment based around the idea that I was having sex with men for drugs, that I was turned gay by drugs, that I got AIDS from drugs and that made me gay, etc. Denied medical care or convinced to refuse medical care on the grounds of either I won't let them see you use drugs or you just want to go to the doctor to score drugs. Denied access to medication even when it was prescribed to me. I have never, not once in my entire life, done drugs. Never even taken one too many Advil. Never even seen weed in person before. The closest I ever came to considering anything was in retaliation to the abuse. And that was, what if I take Adderall before a test just once? No, then she'd be right about everything. And yeah, the hardest part to explain/get across to people is, my mom wasn't abusive before that. Literally, with a single phone call, I went from having a loving, positive, supportive relationship with my mother to a decade of hell. The trauma from which I have not, and I feel I will never recover from. That has certainly decimated every ounce of trust I ever had in my mom, or even in the fundamental concept of family itself. One effing phone call is all it took. F you, Miss Lee. Sorry my native language already made me privy to declencisions and relearning them was the most boring crap. Story number 68. 4th grade. I arrived at school one morning pretty late, right before the bell rang, which was pretty normal as no one in my family were, and still are, not morning people. One of the boys in my class was waiting outside the classroom door, and I saw him as I was walking down the hall. I heard him say, "She's coming!" really excited as he went back into the classroom. I am confused, as no one ever cares if someone is coming down the hall, especially if it is me, because at that time I had about 2 friends. I wasn't really bullied per se, but just not super popular. I walk into the classroom and kids start laughing, like really hardcore laughing at me, and it doesn't take very long to figure out why. My desk was on its side, all of my textbooks and papers and school supplies are in a messy pile on the floor, and there is bright yellow caution tape hanging from the ceiling over the desk in mess. I'm super embarrassed and I'm almost certain I started crying. I honestly don't remember at this part if the teacher told the class to go outside or go to the elective class, or if I cleaned it up and sat down and waited until the class left for the elective. Art, music, PE were all in different classrooms. But what I do remember is the classroom being empty and my 4th grade teacher crouching down to be at my eye level. She told me that she was the one that had overturned my desk, but that it was an accident. She'd been trying to rearrange the desks and seating, and when she went to move mine fell over and my stuff fell out. She thought it would be funny to add the caution tape because of how much stuff I had been able to cram inside my desk. Obviously, I didn't find it funny because the entire class was laughing at me when I walked in, and it seemed like a cruel kid laughter, you know what I mean? And not a funny joking laughter. The reason I remember this, not great memory, but not the worst memory, is because my teacher apologized when she was crouching by me. At that time in my life, the adults I knew, my mom, stepdad, step-grandmother, never apologized. They never did anything wrong. So to have this teacher who had hurt me inadvertently get on my level, explain what she had done, and then admit it was wrong and apologize, that really made an impact. So I can somewhat relate to OP here. As a kid, there were definitely some adults who refused to apologize or did not grasp the concept of it in my life. And unfortunately, that trickled down to me. I wasn't like a troublemaker, but unless like an adult straight up told me to apologize, I wasn't going to do that. So even when I was in the wrong, I was like, whatever, man. And, like as an adult, I've gotten better and it comes a bit more naturally to me, but, I still struggle sometimes. But I mean, I don't know. I would say set a good example for the kids because they will definitely pick up on the bad ones. And I don't think there's anything bad about admitting you're wrong. In some cases, people might even respect you more for it. I'm just saying. Anyway, next story. Story number 69. My very first day of community college in my small rural hometown, I was a history major and so excited for my first history class. I got there early and got a seat at the front. The whole room filled up. Everything was great. Then our professor opened his mouth. I can't remember now what prompted this, but he went straight into an absolute rant with barely introduction, and it lasted the entire class period. He was a New Englander, and we were in the South. He talked about how much he hated our state, how everyone down here was a redneck, a racist, a misogynist. Not you guys, but nothing about the syllabus, nothing about history, just how much he hated to be there. Kids were exchanging looks. I was was mortified to be sitting at the very front and fought to keep my face neutral while he was practically shouting for nearly an hour. Finally, it ended. During our next history class, 7 people showed up out of the previous 30. The rest had all requested to be transferred. I would have too if I'd even known that was an option. We got treated to another rant because our professor had been called into the dean's office due to so many students complaining. I stayed in his class, but I dreaded it. He stuck to the material for the rest of the semester and really wasn't bad at teaching, but I have anxiety and I was constantly bracing for the next explosive rant. I'm not sure if he was fired, but he didn't return to our school the next semester. Story number 70. I have a lot. My first grade teacher, I've told this story before, but I will give the abridged version, got mad at me for a reason I still do not know for this day. I was sitting there in class paying attention, and all of a sudden she yells at me and tells me to change my card in front of the class. I argued back at her because I didn't do anything wrong to the best of my first grader knowledge, but she just yelled back, "You know what you did," and made me change my card to yellow. It was a warning system thing. Your card stays green if you're good, change it to yellow if you do something bad once, and change it to red if you do another bad thing, which means you lose recess for the next day. But I still wonder about what the F I could have done to make her so mad at me. My third grade substitute teacher, my actual teacher was out a good chunk of the year because of maternity leave, yelled at the class about something and I started crying. I'm one of the good kids, but I just got scared of her yelling, and she felt really bad and gave me a peanut butter and fluff sandwich because I told her I didn't eat breakfast when she came to console me. My real third grade teacher, when she came back, was adorable though. Honestly, both the sub and her were stunningly beautiful, and I love them. In fourth grade, my teacher was about to yell at the class and told me and my best friend at the time to cover our ears because we were the two good kids. Then my fifth grade math and science teacher spoke to me after class about standing up for myself because my brother, who was in my class, shared a locker with me and would have me grab his stuff. She told me I need to not let him use me like that, but I remember what stood out to me is she said, "Because you're a woman," which was odd in my little kid mind because I was a kid and didn't feel like a woman yet. Then my sixth grade math and science teacher, I don't have any specific stories about her. I just want to say I effing loved her, and I know my class was awful sometimes, but she was my favorite teacher looking back. I loved when she told stories about her travels across the US. Then my 8th grade English/history teacher gave us a test on my birthday, and in the middle of the test while he was walking by my desk, as teachers do to make sure kids aren't cheating, he slipped me a birthday card. 10 out of 10 teacher. Then my 9th grade Spanish teacher was known for being very strict, and she had a rule where if you didn't do all of the homework, then you'd get a 0. I was still a goody two-shoes kid at this point in my life, so I always did all my homework and was known to be a very good student. At the end of class one day, she gave us the homework for the next day. So I did it, and I come in the next day, and I find out one of the parts of the worksheet I did we weren't supposed to do, and I was supposed to do a different part. Now, plenty of people in this class don't do the homework or mess up, but she decided to make an example out of me the one time I effed up, and she basically shamed me in front of the class. And I cried, of course. That was a pretty heavy day because everyone in the class knew I was one of those A students, so it was a pretty heavy atmosphere for the rest of the class. And my friend who sat behind me, who was the niece of this teacher, comforted me through, which was nice. Then there was my 9th grade homeroom teacher, who was hilariously quirky unironically, and everyone hated him, and he hated almost the whole class, but he liked me because he was friends with my uncle. Us Greeks stick together. I hope he's doing well. Then my 11th grade English teacher told us one class towards the end of the year that he predicted exactly what was going to happen to all of us and refused to tell us. Like, he predicted all of our futures based on how he knew us, but then refused to tell us what he thought. It was odd but funny. I liked that teacher. I personally think he probably thought I was going to be a failure because I was no longer a goody two-shoes at this point and was practically failing the class. He also, one class, he told a story about a kid who died and he pointed at me and said the kid sat in my seat, which was honestly wild. Edit. I thought I would add some more to make this more fun. In 9th grade, my health teacher gave us a test at the end of the semester, and he gave us all the answers to it in order. If we got one wrong, we would fail the test. I think it was less about what was on the test and more of an exercise in listening. Easiest A I've ever got. He was funny and used to pronounce my last name wrong on purpose to be silly. I didn't mind it. I thought it was funny. Then there was my 10th grade chemistry teacher. When we came back from either winter or spring vacation, I don't remember, he spent half the class telling us about how he and his wife saw Hamilton and how fantastic it was, and got me into it because of that. I also remember he had a tungsten wedding band, and I thought that was hella cool. Then my 7th grade math/science teacher, I was sick for a few weeks with a very bad flu, and during that 3 weeks, I came into school one day in the middle of it because I felt decent enough to do so that day, then got sick again because that was too much on my body. While I was sick and practically dying, I still had done all my homework, so when I turned it in, he stopped the class to lecture everyone about how I was sick as hell but still doing all of my homework. So like, what's their excuse? I was mad because I missed the day in class that we were gonna dissect chicken wings, though. Also, I guess my dad ended up yelling at the poor guy because my grade dropped to a B because he counted the days I missed as participation grades. And since this teacher used to teach high school and college, my dad yelled, "They're 13-year-old kids. Why are you grading them as harshly as adults?" Amongst other things. And I feel bad looking back because while my dad was kinda right and I was gonna lose my high honors because the guy graded us really hard, he was just doing his job, and a B isn't the end of the world. And then, and this isn't a teacher story, but in 5th grade after the first quarter went by, I was the only kid in my class who had high honors, and my teacher hung up an award on the wall for me. That's how I made my first friends, kids who would later end up getting high honors too, and how I met my rival. He claimed I was his rival, but he definitely wasn't mine. I didn't care all that much. And he was mad that he missed out on high honors by 1 grade. Edit number 2. Remember my 9th grade homeroom teacher I mentioned? Well, I'm editing to say the half day before Thanksgiving break, we had this really cool puzzle thing that the entire freshman academy was doing, and each class was a team, and it was really fun. I don't remember the specifics anymore, but that was really fun. And freshman year was a wild time, and while I hated high school, I also low-key loved it. The teacher made that day super quirky though, because that's just how he was. But outside of that, I remember seeing him outside of class more than once downtown when I was with my family, and we'd always say hi and chat for a few minutes. My dad thought it was funny, my teacher knew his brother too. So that was very long, that's all I'm going to say. But you know, OP actually made a third edit describing what she had for lunch one day in 2011 in explicit detail. I'm joking. No, she didn't do that. She was excited. She was having fun. She's okay. Anyway, next story. Story number 71. By the way, the title should really read, "What did that one teacher do for you?" But I'm being pedantic. Anyway, first semester of senior year, I had 3-hour exams, 9 hours total, scheduled back to back on the same day of finals week. The last exam was for differential equations. Due to poor midterm performance, I was at the risk of failing the course, which would have prevented me from taking the next course in my major track and forced me to pay for an additional semester of tuition, which I could not afford. As a result, I had studied harder for this exam more than any I had ever taken. But when I sat down to take it, I completely froze. My brain was so exhausted, nervous, and full of other information after 6 hours of exams that it just stopped working. After 2 hours, everyone else had finished and I was left alone, staring despondently at a completely blank exam packet. The professor walked over and asked how many exams I had already taken that day. When I told him, he nodded sagely, sat down beside me and said, "I've got nothing better to do right now, so let's go through this together." And for the next hour and a half, he had me verbally walk through every problem on the exam. He never gave me any hints or directions. He just asked simple questions about what I thought should be done next and why. He didn't even ask me for final answers. He just broke down the test to the concepts that mattered the most and helped me organize my thoughts enough to explain everything I had learned. Under any other professor, I would have failed the exam, but he gave me the exact grade I needed to pass the course. Professor Allen, I will never forget your patience and understanding. I literally would have not gotten my degree without it. Story number 72. Grade 4, Mrs. Campbell. It was at the end of the year, graduation. She gifted each child a book in the class. I think she did it out of pocket too. So it was like Christmas for all of us, getting a gift. Most of the kids weren't into it. Books, lame, etc. But for me, it was a life-changing moment. While everyone else got a cool piece of paperback fiction, I got a big hardcover art book, looking beast of a book with a dragon on the cover that consumed me for years to come. You see, my childhood was unusual. My father passed when I was young. My mom was like a punk rock artist criminal, and we moved at least once a year. I attended more schools than years of school by several. But that book, it became an anchor and constant source of joy. You see, it wasn't just some art book. While its nearly 300 pages were in fact filled with amazing art, all the art was captioned, paragraphs of text. It described events, people, places, maps, diagrams, cities, and pictures of massive battles, all captioned. It contained a whole universe of stories, the history of a world not our own, laid out like nonfiction. It opened my eyes to so much wonder that there is no way I would be the same person I am now without its influence. The book was called The Tolkien Illustrated Encyclopedia. Looking back at it all, she must have seen something in me, because that book really showed a favoritism to me at the time. The trade paperbacks the rest of the class got were probably about as expensive combined as the book I was gifted. I love you, Mrs. Campbell. Thank you, wherever you may be. Story number 73. Had a history history teacher in high school who was also a coach for the football team, I believe. This dude was a hard ass on most of his students, but at the same time, almost as if he didn't want to be there himself teaching. I had somewhat of a biased opinion that he honestly showed favoritism towards his athlete students. Anyways, during one of my years there, I had him for first period, and it was during a time where I really started to fancy a girl who sat about 3 chairs up and 1 to the right of me. She was in the front row. This girl and I eventually started dating, and this teacher would sometimes see us around campus as a couple. One day was movie day in his class, and the seat next to her on the left was empty, absent student most likely, but it had like 2 tall stacks of paper that the teacher left there. I was such an introvert that I didn't have the balls to move to the seat given that everybody was pretty much almost seated, and plus there were papers there anyways. I kept eyeing it like I was going to move but just couldn't do it. Damn nerves and anxiety of being told to go back to my desk and whatnot if I got caught. Feels like time is running out to make a decision, and I decide internally, F it, I can do it. And as soon as that happens, the teach comes by closing the door heading towards his desks and makes direct eye contact with me, picks up the stacks of papers and says, "What?" with a smirk, and he looks down at the desk with his eyes effing signaling me in a way. He effing knew, and he walked away. Long story short, I got to sit with the girl I fancied because the teacher knew I fancied her and was being a bro. We'll never forget Mr. Carney, dope man, was just too immature to realize it at the time. Story number 74. I've had a couple of really good teachers. One was my 6th grade science teacher, Mrs. Shaw. She asked the class a question about stars, and the room was silent for a few minutes because we couldn't figure it out. I had a light bulb moment, and she just happened to be looking at my face when I went from looking confused to looking excited, and from then on, she'd always look at me first after she'd ask the class a question. Not wanting to let her down made me study. Just being interested in what I had to say made a better student out of me. Another was my 9th grade algebra teacher, Miss Wiggins. I was dating this girl who was a year older than me, and she was talking a bunch of crap about Miss W while we were walking down the hall. All I said was, "Well, I think she's cool," but I was thinking to myself that she was a total female dog. Then Miss W appears behind us and tells my girlfriend that people would like her better if she wasn't such a female dog herself. Hilarious. The last was my world history teacher in 10th grade, Coach Hayes. He really went out of his way to turn names and dates into interesting material, and rightfully so because history is the greatest story ever told. Every rise and downfall, every act of heroism, every brilliant victory, tragic defeat, every step forward for the human race. All history. Coach Hayes was just an amazing teacher, and he used to give extra credit for reading historical fiction novels. They weren't 100% factually accurate, but they were interesting and made me want to learn more. Really thankful for those 3. I'd be worse off without them. Story number 75. I'm sure there are more than the ones I have here, but here are a few, all from high school. First, my course instructor paid for me to be able to participate in one of the chorus groups I wanted to be in because my parents didn't have the money. He was awesome. Then my math teacher, maybe Algebra 2, was also our gym teacher. He let me borrow a scientific calculator on the first day because I didn't have one. They were required in the course. Unfortunately, he wouldn't let me continue to borrow it after the first day, so I had to drop the class. The only class I ever dropped, if I recall correctly. Before that experience, I was interested in and decently good at math, not so much afterwards. Then my English teacher had us read parts of the Bible and discuss it in class. He genuinely wanted to hear our opinions and thoughts on things and truly encouraged creativity and open discussion. Swearing was even okay if we thought it added to our pieces. Then, not a teacher but still at school, my principal argued with me when I tried to sign myself out for school for the day. As I was 18, a legal adult, I asserted that I could sign myself out and leave whenever I wished. But my dad ended up having to come down to meet with him before he would concede the point. Then, again, not a teacher but still at school, my guidance counselor had a meeting with me to discuss what I wanted to do with my future after school. I said I was really interested in art school. At the time, I really wanted to go to RSID, and I was on the honor roll and had already participated in a vocational and summer art program, and she handed me a packet with community college school options in the area and told me that is what I should be looking for because of my financial situation. And then finally, my almost art teacher said I couldn't be in her class, which would have actually progressed my skills instead of repeating them, and this was because I hadn't taken the beginner art course that the school provided. Yup. Story number 76. So I was really good in Latin classes. Like, people jokingly accused me of being a native speaker good. Due to this, I would always get the best grades, 15 or 14 points out of 15 where I live, in both the written exams as well as the oral participation grade. I went to school by tram, and usually I arrived at the classroom about 10 minutes before class started. But in 13th, the last grade, I arrived 5 minutes late on 2 different occasions. The reason was in both cases that the tram had suffered an accident and could not drive on. Each time I showed my Latin teacher the slip that the tram operators give out when it is their fault that the tram isn't on time. Both times he looked at it and said okay and never spoke of it again. When the last oral participation grade was due, he told me, "You get 14 points this time." Mind you, I've been having 15 points all through 11th to 13th grade up until now in oral participation. So I asked him, why did I get a lower grade this time? Have my entries to the discussions not been as good lately? And then he says to me, "No, but you were late 2 times, and in the time you were missing, others were able to make the remarks and comments you then couldn't do." And I asked him whether he hadn't remembered the official slips I showed him, and he said, "Yes, but I'm on time every day too, regardless of stuff like that, so you need to take into account for your planning that accidents might happen." And that was the last of it. Due to this one grade, which made about 1/6 of our final grade in 13th grade, I did not get my Grobs Latinum with the best possible grade. In hindsight, it seems like he didn't like me the whole time I had him as a teacher. Still makes me angry though. Story number 77. Junior year in high school, mom made too much money for me to qualify for free breakfast or lunch, yet never gave me money to buy food. Didn't have food at home because she was always gone, off partying or whatever. I got some snacks off friends when I could, but I felt bad asking for freebies all the time. So that week I was lacking in the snack department. My last 2 classes of the day were right across the hall from each other. I got up for my math class and passed out before I could reach the door to history. I woke up to my history teacher putting his jacket under my head and trying to talk to me. He said he saw me fall and sorta caught me so I didn't just bang my head on the concrete. He said he wanted to call for the nurse, but it would just cause problems because they'd probably call an ambulance or something. I wasn't about to get in trouble at home because of this, so I begged him not to. Finally, he agreed and just sat with me for a minute. I was able to sit up against the wall to his class, but I still felt like crap, so I couldn't even stand. I just felt so weak. After a minute, he asked me what was going on, and I told him I hadn't eaten going on for like 4 days. I was kind of out of it because I woke up again to him putting a salad container thing next to me with a Milky Way bar on top of it. He told me to eat and come into class if I felt like it, and he went to go teach class. And I cried as I ate that salad and candy bar. I don't know how long I took, but I finally got up and sat down in class to take some crappy notes, and when I walked out of class, he told me he hoped I felt better soon. I never ever forgot Mr. M. It's been 12 years since I was in his class, but I will always remember that day. Story number 78. 3 teachers. I always sucked at social studies, history, government, geography. We had a test in the 7th grade on the different parts of the US government, and an answer to a question was cabinet. I put cupboard. Teacher made sure everyone knew and had a good laugh at my expense. Another teacher taught English as well as driver's education. During a bit in DE, he forced the car into the shoulder of the road and wanted me to bring it back on the road as smoothly as possible. Once he took over the secondary wheel, I knew I couldn't fight against his strength pulling us off the road, so I simply let go of the wheel and let him do his thing. I got scolded for it, but we also didn't crash. He brought it up in class maybe a month later, mentioned my name, and made some comments about me doing it because it works like that in video games, which I never said, but whatever, more laughing at my expense. And then the last teacher actually did a good thing. A graduation requirement was passing government. It was named that, but it was really a mix of US government and world geography. Anyway, I was a solid A to B student, but in that class I was dragging through with an F. I wasn't alone. A few other students struggled as well, but I was the bottom of the barrel. Our teacher then made a deal that he would host a few after-school classes, and anybody that attended would get a letter grade increase per class that they attended. I attended all of them and finished the class with a B, thanks to him. I didn't get screwed out of graduation due to one class that my brain is unable to handle. Story number 79. This comment will inevitably be buried by the 6.5 thousand other comments, but here it is. My freshman year science teacher, Mr. Kulik. He taught geophysical science at all levels. I was in the honors class. He took an interest in me that no other teacher has. I was always a slacker, but always the smartest kid in the class. Sounds like bragging, but I have stories to back it up. And I never worked hard, and he definitely let my grades show it. I was on the brink of failing one semester when he told me to meet him after class. I was reluctant to go because why would an asshat 14-year-old want to go get yelled at and be told he was failing, right? Despite this, I went to go speak to him. He said to me, "I can tell you're easily the smartest person in the room, maybe the smartest person in your class. You have shown that you're capable of great things, so why do you slack off?" And at this point, I kinda chuckled. Again, asshat 14-year-old. He saw this as his face becomes more serious, and he says, you remind me of this one kid I had a few years back. He was a lot like you. Didn't care about school, never tried, but was easily the smartest kid I've ever taught. You want to know what he does now? And I said, yeah. And he said, he does nothing, because everyone thought he was a loser because his grades were piss poor. You could be the smartest guy to ever live, but if you don't show it, no one will know. And that last line stuck with me that day, playing in my head over and over and over again. Since then, I turned my schooling around, and come May, I will graduate from Rutgers University with a GPA of 3.8, and I have that man to thank for it. I doubt you'll ever see this, Mr. K, but if you do, thank you. Story number 80. In the second grade, my school noticed my reading level was above my grade, but did not feel comfortable moving me up a whole grade. So for 2 years in a row, I'd go to the next grade up for my literature and spelling, etc. In the fourth grade, my mom didn't have me do this because she was putting me in a different school the following year. She just didn't like the fifth grade teacher or something, I don't know. However, my teacher that year, Mrs. Bishop, was familiar to me already since she had already been my English teacher. To be honest, I never thought anything about the special accommodations for me other than it was pretty cool getting to walk from the little kid building to the big kid building. Anyway, we were learning multiplication tables and division and whatnot in math, but I had a question about the vocabulary. I raised my hand and asked whether a quotient went with multiplication or division. Then I can't remember if she rolled her eyes or not, but I will never forget what she said to me. She said, "To be so smart, you're pretty stupid." And I did not speak voluntarily in class again until my junior year in college. Every time it was my turn to put my geometry homework answer on the board in high school, explain a chemistry homework problem in a college class, present a lab report, etc., the anxiety I felt was simply indescribable. I put off taking public speaking until it came down to taking the class or not to graduating college. But I'm 25 now, and I did, and I have a bachelor's degree in applied math, and I got a full ride for my PhD in atmospheric science, and I have what I truly consider to be the honor to teach college students about climate change while I get a doctorate. I can't even believe I get paid to do something I love so much, and I certainly will never be able to understand how another educator could say something so harmful to a child. I was only 9. Well, folks, much like this story and many others we read, I don't feel like I was personally surprised. I don't know about you, but I certainly was not surprised to see so many stories about just teachers doing horrible things or being horrible people, because I don't know what it is, but I think it's the power or something, but it attracts a certain type of people at times. Oh boy, I can traumatize the future of my country? That sounds fun. And of course, we got plenty of stories of people being nice and nurturing, which I think you need to in order to be a good teacher, in my opinion. But like tormenting and traumatizing the youth? Like, what benefit does that have on society? Like, in what world does roasting a 9-year-old have any positive benefits to their self-esteem? If you can find me one, let me know so I can bomb it. But anyway, guys, as some of you may already know, I'm the narrator on the Really Sparked sister channel, and I was only temporarily filling in over here. I don't know if I'll be back or when, but you know what? I appreciate the positive comments and the mean comments and the "who the hell is this? Bring back the other narrator" comments. I read all the comments, folks. I'm just saying. But you know what? I enjoy doing this, and I will miss you, even though most of you already watch both channels anyway. But you know what? Thanks for having me. Maybe I'll see you again. I always enjoy reading these videos, and I just like to, employ positivity, sense of humor. That's what I do, because some of these can get depressing and sad. But anyway, guys, thanks for watching. Have a really good day, and bye-bye!